Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku became the underdog hero part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below. And let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story softSpokenLoser from fanfiction.net. So let's start the video. Izuku kept his head down low as he made his way through the massive halls of 𝐴, trying to keep the number of eyes on him to a minimum. His tie hung tightly around his neck like a noose, making him pull at it periodically in an attempt to loosen it. He had never been good at tying those damn things. He could still hardly believe that he was actually here, going to high school at the same place that had raised 𝗵𝗲, best genius, and all might. The very same. Somehow this weak, useless, quirkless Izuku shook his head slightly, trying to banish those thoughts. He really needed to stop doing that. Let's see, he began, murmuring to himself quietly. 1B, 1B, 1B. Izuku stared up at the massive door to his new homeroom, with no small amount of trepidation. Why was it so big? Already fearing the worst. He really hoped 𝗵𝘃𝗀 and that mean kid with the glasses weren't in his homeroom. He'd rather not be ostracized before the first bell even rang. Knowing his luck, he wouldn't have much say in the matter. Izuku shook his head again. Zoning out, just like his muttering, was always a problem for him, even more so since his days at 𝗲𝗲. At least when he muttered he could bite his lips, and keep himself from talking. His mind was much harder to wrangle than that. Izuku took a deep breath, and steeled himself for what was to come. He gripped the door, quivering slightly, and slid it open. The room was surprisingly normal, all things considered. It was very spacious, which Izuku expected given how big the door alone was, and the far wall was pretty much all window. But that was as far as the spectacle went. Izuku could appreciate that. As he quietly walked in, a few heads turned towards him, but nobody said anything. He took a quick glance at the faces, and let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding in when he realized he couldn't recognize anyone. That meant no glasses guy, and no 𝗵𝘃𝗀. Thank God. On the chalkboard the phrase "pick any seat" was scrawled out in big, white letters, so Izuku helped himself to the seat furthest in the back, closest to the wall. Ideally, he would have taken the seat on the far wall, but something about that wall composed of one big window just rubbed him the wrong way. He wasn't too good with heights anymore, and they were pretty high up. It would be very distracting for him, at the very least. Izuku kept to himself, eyes trained squarely on his desk as the rest of the room slowly filled with students. Every time the door opened, he took a peek at the face that entered. The fear of 𝗵𝘃𝗀's snarling visage entering the room omnipresent. But each and every time he was blessed with a complete stranger instead. A girl with silver hair, a short, stout boy, a boy with a speech bubble for a head. Izuku didn't care who it was, anyone would be better than 𝗵𝘃𝗀. There wasn't much fanfare as everyone made themselves comfortable in the room. There wasn't much talking, although Izuku could hear a group of boys getting along rather well somewhere on the other side of the room, and Izuku couldn't blame them. It was their first day of 𝐴 hero course. Who wouldn't be nervous? The only interaction Izuku had with one of his classmates was with a boy who was pitch black, with pale white hair. When he had entered the classroom he had immediately made his way to the desk Izuku was in, only to freeze when he had realized it was already occupied. He stared at Izuku, a clear frown on his face. But before Izuku could muster up the courage to offer up his seat, the boy sighed and took the desk in front of him. Izuku just went back to staring quietly at his desk, not wanting to draw any more ire from the boy than he already had. Plus, trying to keep as still as a statue helped him to quell the slight shaking that had begun to rack him. Right before the bell was set to ring, their teacher walked through the door, and it was a shock to Izuku. 𝗏𝗏, the blood hero. He had so much merch of him. Izuku had to bite his bottom lip to keep from going on a muttering spree, and even then it was close. He was even in his hero costume. It was almost enough to make a hero nerd like Izuku faint, even though the man had pretty much every student's attention the moment he walked it, thanks to both his hulking figure and his blood red and silver costume, making him stick out like a sore thumb. He cleared his throat in an attempt to fully quiet everyone down. It worked. "Good morning, everyone," 𝗏𝗏 rumbled, his deep voice echoing throughout the room easily. "And welcome to you, 𝐴. My name is 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐨, and I am your homeroom teacher for this year. You may call me Ken Sensei or 𝗏𝗏 Sensei, as that is my hero name." He paused for a moment, allowing his eyes to roll over the 20 students sitting in front of him. Izuku hoped he imagined the man's eyes lingering on him for a split second longer than everybody else. Being a hero is no easy task, he began solemnly, causing most of the students' backs to go ramrod straight. And your time at this institution will not be either. It will be rigorous. It will be demanding. Just because you pass the entrance exams does not mean you are safe. I am not an easy teacher, and I will not allow you to skid by in this class and end up being killed in the field because of it. His eyes softened at that line, allowing everyone to truly grasp what he was saying. With that being said, I'd like to think I am a fair teacher. I was in your shoes once, even if it was hundreds of years ago. A few snickers drifted up from the class at the line, and 𝐷 allowed himself to smirk. I will do my best to ensure each and every one of you make it to graduation. I am here for all of you. Please do come to me if you have any questions about anything at any point in the year, or if you need anything from me, or if you just need to talk to someone. 𝐷 clasped his hands together. Now, we have a few minutes until orientation, so as lame as it is, I'd like it if we went around the room and all introduced ourselves. A groan rose up from most of the room, causing 𝐷 to sigh. I know, he sighed. But it's the easiest way for you all to meet each other. You will be classmates with each other for the next 3 years. Might as well get started now. You don't have to say anything specific, all right? Just your name and anything else you want to add will suffice. He took a glance around the room before his eyes landed on the desk closest to the door. Kendo-san, why don't we start with you? The girl Kendo, he supposed, shrugged before standing up and offering everyone a bright smile and wave. She had medium-length orange hair done up into a ponytail and bright teal eyes, and was admittedly rather pretty. Izuku knew that meant nothing. He knew better than anyone that looks could be deceiving. Hello everyone, she greeted politely. I'm Kendo Itsuka. It's a pleasure to meet all of you. I'm a big fan of martial arts, and my family owns a dojo. I'm excited to spend the next few years with you all. She sat down after that, 𝐷 nodding at her in appreciation. They went row by row, meaning there was plenty of time before Izuku was called. There were a few notable standouts, like Honuki, Tsunotori, and Bondo. His head was a glue dispenser. So cool. But overall, most of the class had similarly concise introductions. Some of them had such interesting quirks as well. Not everyone deigned to share what their quirk was, but Izuku was struggling to contain his excitement regardless. It was almost a game to him, trying to figure out what their quirks were based on personality and appearance alone. Did Shiozaki's quirk have to do with her thorny hair? Was Kiriwaro's black skin a byproduct of his quirk in the sense that it dyed his skin? Or was it from spending so much time in shadow? Izuku took a breath. Almost. He had to keep reminding himself that it wouldn't be very smart of him to out himself as a nerdy freak before he had even introduced himself. And as Kaibara sat down, suddenly all eyes were on Izuku. Shit. Izuku hoped nobody had a quirk that could smell fear. Hi, he managed, trying not to let his stutter affect him. I'm Midoriya Izuku, and I'm a big fan of heroes. Please take care of me. Someone coughed, or at least pretended to, because Izuku was positive he heard a boring. In there, oh god, people were starting to snicker. Izuku's face burned scarlet as he sat down, embarrassment cranked up to 10. Why did he even bother? He winced as the boy to his left, Kamakiri, got up and introduced himself in a way so brash it almost reminded him of Bakugo. He really was screwed, wasn't he? Izuku didn't pay too much attention to the final few people giving out introductions, more focused on making himself seem as small as possible. Maybe then he could be forgotten and allowed to fly under the radar for the next 3 years. It would certainly be better than being known as a stuttering loser. Somehow, though, he doubted it. All right, 𝐷 said once everyone had finished. That's good enough for now, but it's time for us to get a move on. Orientation is in a few minutes, as well as the entrance ceremony, and as bland as they might be, they're important. With that, everyone filed out behind 𝐷, Izuku gladly taking a spot in the back of the group. The less eyes on him, the better. Orientation wasn't that bad. It mainly consisted of Principal Nezu half explaining, half humbly bragging about UA and its facilities and achievements. It was pretty cool how a bunch of the staff like Recovery Girl and Hound Dog had speeches to give as well. Izuku loved seeing so many heroes in one place. He had half a mind to pull out a notebook and start asking for autographs. The only thing that seemed to be awry was that there was a big empty space in the bleachers next to 1B. and based on the tired sigh Vlad King Sensei had given when he saw it. This was a regular occurrence. Nezu had been subtle about it, but Izuku was pretty sure he saw the principal's eyes flick over there a few times as well. He wondered if the all-too-familiar explosion that went off outside halfway through the principal's speech had anything to do with it. Izuku sat down at the first empty table he could find in the cafeteria, far away from where most of the other students had settled. There were plenty of tables, so it wasn't too far-fetched to say that nobody would. "Hiya, can I sit here?" Izuku jumped in his seat, eyes darting up to see one of his classmates. If he remembered correctly, and he certainly did, Fukudashi was his name. He certainly wasn't going to forget a face or lack thereof, considering his head was a speech bubble like that. Sure," Izuku responded quietly. "Fukudashi-san, right?" "Yep," he responded proudly. "And you're Midoriya, yeah?" Izuku just nodded silently as Fukudashi unceremoniously plopped his stuff down into an empty seat and took one for himself, still unsure of why anyone would want to sit with him. Was he really going to be punked on the first day? Fukudashi bobbed his head, something Izuku could only distinguish because his shoulders dipped as well. "Cool, nice to meet ya." Likewise." Fukudashi hummed to himself as Izuku started to eat, causing the green-haired teen to look at him in confusion. Fukudashi-san," he started, nearly losing his nerve once he turned towards him. "Why don't you have any food?" Fukudashi groaned, and Izuku immediately ready to apologize, putting his hands up in surrender, but the other boy beat him to it. "Aw, dude, it's awful," he whined, the image of a sweat drop appearing in the top corner of his speech bubble. "I don't have a mouth, so I can't eat normally, but I still need food. It's a whole process, so I just do it at home, you know?" Izuku did not, in fact, know, but he nodded along anyways. "Anyways," Fukudashi prattled, "what did you think of the classes today? It's so cool that we get to be taught by pros, right?" Izuku couldn't help but brighten up a tad at the mention of their classes. After orientation, they had a short period with all of their teachers, with the exception of their foundational hero studies teacher back in their classroom. And it was like heaven for him. "Why, yeah," Izuku agreed. "It's one thing to listen to Present Mike's radio show, but to actually see him in person and have him teach us is something else entirely." "I know, right? Present Mike is one of my favorite heroes. His quirk is just like mine." If there was a way to pique Izuku's interest, that was it. "Really?" Izuku's eyes lit up like tiny stars as he leaned forward, smiling wide. "What's your quirk?" Fukudashi laughed. "Damn, so you do have a personality. Here I was, thinking you were just a mopey loner, and the moment we start talking quirks you go crazy." Izuku froze. He screwed up again, didn't he? "Anyways, my quirk is called comic," Fukudashi explained, unperturbed by Izuku's excitement. "Aside from making my head ache, well, whatever this is, it lets me make onomatopoeia real. Here, watch." Fukudashi made a weird noise, almost like he was trying to impersonate a spring or a trampoline. To Izuku's complete shock, the boing sound that Fukudashi made actually appeared on his speech bubble in kanji form and floated off his face. He then placed the kanji on the table, pulled out a pencil from his bag, and dropped it on the word. It bounced off, flying right back into Fukudashi's hand. Izuku was in awe. "That's so cool," Izuku whisper shouted. "Can you make up new onomatopoeia? Or are you constricted to a certain list of sounds? What decides how powerful the onomatopoeia you create is? If you, whoa, is your quirk speed talking or something?" Fukudashi joked. "I can barely tell what you're saying." Izuku immediately clamped his mouth shut, face burning red once again as he embarrassed himself for the second time in as many minutes in front of his new classmate. Sorry," Izuku muttered, dejectedly looking down at his lap. "Geez, dude, no need to be so nervous," Fukudashi said, putting his hands up placatingly. "I'm only kidding, you know." "Why, yeah, sorry," Izuku apologized again, trying to think of a way to explain his skittishness. "It's just that. It's kinda nerve-wracking actually being at you. You know?" Fukudashi nodded empathetically. "I hear ya. Going here is like a dream come true. Literally. I was so excited to come here that I almost missed my morning train because I couldn't fall asleep." That got Izuku to smile, but also to think a bit if Fukudashi needed sleep. Did he dream? Did he have a brain in the same way Izuku had? How was he able to see? "How, anyways," Fukudashi continued. "I told you about my quirk. What's yours? Does it have anything to do with the fact that your hair is green?" Izuku rubbed the back of his head awkwardly. "You'd think that, but no," he muttered, before straightening up a bit. "My quirk is nothing special. It's excuse me." Izuku blinked in surprise at a new voice, turning his head to see another one of his new classmates. The boy was practically a giant in comparison to Izuku and Fukudashi. But what made him stick out even further was his yellow skin and peculiar head that apparently could dispense glue. Izuku definitely remembered his name. Bondo was too unique to forget. "What's up, big guy?" Fukudashi asked cheerfully. "Would it be alright if I sat with you?" Bondo asked simply. It was subtle, but when he squinted, Izuku could see the arms that held Bondo's lunch tray shaking ever so slightly. He doubted Fukudashi noticed his speech bubble grew a big circumflex emoticon, as if it was a face. "Sure," Fukudashi said, speaking for Izuku as well. "We don't mind." Izuku did not, in fact, mind. But even if he did, he doubted he would be able to say anything. His mind was busy racing a mile a minute. People, his classmates, wanted to sit with him. They willingly chose to interact with him, instead of avoiding him or worse, bullying him. It was almost too good to be true. Bondo nodded gratefully, taking one of the seats next to Fukudashi for himself as he began to poke at his food. "Say, do you guys remember if Ken-sensei said who our foundational hero studies teacher is?" Fukudashi asked. "I kinda spaced out during that whole teacher introduction thing." Izuku blinked. "It was only like 20 minutes per class, at most." Fukudashi shrugged. "I get bored easily. Besides, all any of them were doing was introducing themselves and explaining the syllabus. I don't need to pay attention to all of that." Izuku and Bondo shuddered in unison. Midnight Sensei had a lot of fun teasing the class during her brief period with 1B. If he had a mirror, Izuku was sure he would have looked like a strawberry. Judging by the semi-predatory look in Midnight Sensei's eyes, there was a lot more where that came from. "Well, Ken-sensei didn't say, but..." Bondo paused. "I heard a rumor that All Might was going to be teaching at you, eh?" Izuku choked on his spit. All Might?" Izuku managed, barely overcoming the shock his system was going through. "He's going to be teaching here," Bondo shrugged. "Maybe. It's only a rumor. Personally, I can't imagine the #1 hero being a teacher." "All Might teaching here would be so cool," Fukudashi cheered. "He'd automatically be one of my top 3 teachers here." Izuku gasped as if Fukudashi had just insulted his lineage. "Just top 3, he said, aghast. "It's All Might, the #1 hero, the symbol of peace." "Yeah, but I already told you that Present Mike is one of my favorites," Fukudashi countered. "Plus, Midnight is, like, super hot. All Might's great and all, but I know who I'd rather spend detention with." Izuku vehemently disagreed with just about everything Fukudashi said, but he wasn't going to fight a losing battle. Especially against his new classmate? Friend? Were the 3 of them friends? It had been so long since he had friends, he didn't know what constituted a friendship anymore. He really hoped they wanted to be friends. They were so nice to him. "All Might would be awesome," Bondo agreed. "But I think it would be amazing if the wild pussycats were our teachers, even if it's unlikely." "Who?" Fukudashi asked, a question mark appearing in his speech bubble. "Oh, do you mean that group of 3 girls and the dude that all wear matching costumes?" Bondo nodded in affirmation. "Yeah, them. They mostly specialize in team rescue training, but are each individually gifted and are known to be able to fight villains as well. I think we could learn a lot from them." "Oh, so it's not because the blonde one is hot?" Fukudashi asked innocently. Bondo made a strange sound that sounded like a cross between a wheeze and the toll of a bell, before trying and failing to formulate a defense against Fukudashi's allegations. Fukudashi, for his part, began to cackle hysterically. Izuku hid a smile behind his hands as he watched them interact. He really hoped they wanted to be friends. Okay, maybe they didn't. Izuku had only gotten up for a moment to throw his waist away, the final bell for the day ringing throughout the cafeteria, and by the time he had gotten back, Fukudashi and Bondo were gone. He tried to look for them, but it was impossible to pick out anybody from the mass of students rushing for the exit. Of course. Why was Izuku surprised? As he stepped outside, he let out a shuddering sigh, the wetness in his eyes all too familiar. This was how it always was, and how it always would be. He would always be the same old Deku. Useless, friendless, worthless. "Yo, Midoriya-kun, over here." Izuku was shaken out of his self-loathing thoughts with a jerk, looking up to see Fukudashi and Bondo, waving him over to their little group. "We were gonna wait for you in there." Fukudashi jerked a finger back towards the school. "But it was getting pretty cramped, so we decided to just wait out here." Bondo nodded. "Apologies for not letting you know, Midoriya-san." It's fine," Izuku breathed out, simultaneously shocked and relieved beyond measure. Why, you don't need to apologize. Yeah, Fukudashi agreed. So can we leave now? I heard that the principal sends drones after students who stay on campus after school ends. How could that be true? Bondo questioned. UA offers a variety of extracurricular activities to its students, especially those in the hero course. Fukudashi shrugged. No. Heard it from a third year. But did you hear the principal earlier? He sounded super smart. Wouldn't shock me if he had some secret robot security force. If Bondo had eyes, Izuku was sure he would have rolled them. I don't think they could do that to high schoolers, even if they wanted to, Fukudashi-san. You're just no fun. A tongue appeared on Fukudashi's speech bubble, as though he were blowing a raspberry at Bondo. Back me up here, Midoriya. Izuku just laughed a bit. The three of them making their way to the train station together as Fukudashi tried in vain to convince them of Nezu's mad schemes. It was nice. Maybe really would be different. Maybe he could be a hero. Yo, Midoriya-kun, Fukudashi called. Over here. Izuku jerked in surprise as he entered the classroom, still not really used to being paid much mind by his peers. At least, not in a positive way. Hello, Fukudashi-san, Bondo-san, Izuku greeted as he made his way over to his friends, who were crowded around Fukudashi's desk along with another of their classmates, 𝐼𝐻𝐻𝐿. If Izuku remembered right, we need you to settle a debate for us, Midoriya-kun, Fukudashi explained. You see, 𝐼𝐻𝐻𝐿-kun here thinks that Hawks would beat 𝗫𝗫𝗏 in a one-on-one fight. But me and Bondo-kun think 𝗫𝗫𝗏 would win, Izuku blinked. Based on your interest in quirks, as well as your vast knowledge of heroes, Bondo continued, we thought it would be smartest to consult you on your opinion in this matter. Izuku blushed. All he had done yesterday was ask about Fukudashi and Bondo's quirks, some more as they made their way to the train station yesterday. And maybe ask a few extra questions. And maybe go on a mumble rant about heroes with similar quirks they could learn from. And maybe, he brought this on himself. At least they weren't openly mocking him for his interests, like everyone at Aldera used to. That was a welcome surprise. Well, Izuku responded quietly. Hawks would win. Fukudashi gasped dramatically. No, Midoriya-kun, you're supposed to be on our side. Izuku flinched slightly, practically unnoticeable to the eyes of the guys around him. Did he mess up? Just sorry, Fukudashi-san, he tried, eyes darting down. No, Hawks would win. Bondo hummed. Why do you think so, Midoriya-kun? 𝗫𝗫𝗏 is incredibly smart, and has an incredible quirk. Hellflame would burn through Hawks's feathers easily. Izuku rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Yeah, that's true, he began, forcing an awkward laugh. But Hawks is fast. Really fast. And the control he has over his feathers is absolute. That, combined with Hellflame's drawback of not making 𝗫𝗏𝗏 immune to the heat, means the fight would likely devolve into a hit-and-run style battle, where Hawks repeatedly forces 𝗫𝗏𝗏 to activate his quirk in order to avoid taking critical damage from Hawks, while 𝗫𝗏𝗏 is unable to properly counterattack due to Hawks's raw speed. All it would take is one slip-up from 𝗫𝗏𝗏 to end the fight, and even if he was perfect in his reactions, he has less time to win the fight, because the longer his quirk is active, the likelier it is that 𝗫𝗏𝗏 begins to take damage from self-inflicted burns. Izuku finally took a breath, only to realize that Bondo, 𝐼𝐻𝐻𝐿, and Fukudashi were all staring at him, eyes wide and mouths hanging wide open. Or something like that. He muttered quietly, eyes downcast as his blush returned full force. Whoa, Fukudashi breathed out. That was, like, a major nerd out. Awesome. Izuku looked up in surprise. Huh? Bondo nodded in agreement. It truly is incredible to see someone with such vast knowledge on heroics. Izuku turned scarlet. It's not that impressive. IJ just like heroes. We all like heroes, Fukudashi corrected, cackling. You love them. Izuku sputtered in an attempt to defend himself, embarrassed beyond belief. But that just made Fukudashi laugh harder. Bondo wasn't far behind him, a deep chuckle emanating from him, and even 𝐼𝐻𝐻𝐿 had to muffle himself with his hand. Fortunately for Izuku, the bell rang, and with it Vlad King entered the room, an order of get to your seats on his lips, sparing him any more embarrassment this morning. As he took his seat, he could only wonder if they had been laughing at him, or laughing because of him. He really hoped they weren't laughing at him. All right, little listeners, Present Mike encouraged. Can anybody tell me what is wrong with sentence number 4, silence? Come on, he groaned. I know all of you had to take English in middle school. Present Mike pointedly ignored 𝐀𝐦, the only actual native English speaker in the class, who had her hand politely raised the entire time. Izuku knew the answer, of course. He was pretty good with English. He attributed it to all the time he spent worshipping All Might and consuming as much media of the man as he could, including the half that was English. Plus, when he was younger, he thought it would make it easier to talk with his dad, working overseas in America and all. What an idiot he was. Izuku let out a muted sigh. Present Mike was beginning to get disheartened, and looked like he was just going to pick a random student. He really didn't want to volunteer himself, but the look in the poor teacher's eye was just too much for Izuku to handle. He didn't want to disappoint the hero again. He already did that during the entrance exam, where he made a fool of himself with his muttering. Present Mike zeroed in on Izuku's slowly raising hand like a hungry shark to a surfer. "All right," he shouted. "Let's hear it, Midoriya." Izuku tried not to wilt under the pressure of having so many eyes on him again. "The sentence uses the incorrect form of there," he said quietly, "and it uses the contraction for its when it doesn't need to." "Correctamundo," Present Mike cheered, his volume perfectly countering Izuku's quietness. "Now, can anybody help me out with the next one?" Silence. Again. Izuku wasn't going to volunteer himself twice. Present Mike sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose, although he didn't seem too mad. It was more like an exasperated fondness. "Alrighty, little listeners," he clapped his hands together, before pushing off the desk he had been leaning back on. "Since I can't get a measure on your English this way, homework. Textbook pages 9 and 10, all the odd-numbered problems." The class groaned in unison. Izuku could pick out Fukudashi as one of the loudest complainers in the group. Settle down, Present Mike laughed. "You don't have to make sure they're all correct. I'll be grading for completion, but please put some effort into it. It'll be a benchmark for you, so I know where we're all at here." Izuku listened to the class's murmurings for a few more moments, before quietly pulling out the textbook and simply getting to work, unaware of the stare he was receiving from a certain blonde girl. Izuku stretched out his sore wrist, letting out a satisfied groan as it cracked and popped. Midnight Sensei had given them a pop quiz, which included several small essays for their first class together, and it had put Izuku's writing hand through the ringer. "Midoriya-kun," Fukudashi called from a few seats ahead, "things already packed. Let's go get lunch, I'm hungry." "But you don't eat at lunch," Bondo pointed out, causing Fukudashi to huff and his speech bubble to deflate. I'm coming," Izuku called, a small smile on his face. It really was nice to have friends. Fukudashi and Bondo were awesome. Fukudashi was funny and outgoing, and was the head of their little group. Ironic, wasn't it? Izuku didn't mind though. He wasn't one for the spotlight. Neither was Bondo, the boy even more of a strong silent type than he was. Not that Izuku was strong in any sense of the word, but you get the point. "Hey, green boy." Izuku wasn't proud of the squeak he made at the shout, nor the fact that he jumped a solid meter off the ground in surprise. He had to put a hand on his heart to still it. It had begun to beat rapidly at the fright he had just received. Damn, he really was a wuss. "You okay?" Izuku looked up, meeting the big, blue eyes of a girl has crashed. Damn, this was embarrassing. He couldn't even get a single word out. He was pretty sure he heard Fukudashi snickering in the background, him and Bondo having been lucky enough to stick around to witness this interaction. It only made his face burn more. The girl cocked her head at him, blinking her eyes slowly in confusion. "Wow, he kinda looks like a strawberry right now," she muttered under her breath, in English for good measure. Izuku made a weird choking sound, like he was trying to hack up a lung. "'S strawberry." The girl lit up immediately, pointing a finger at him in excitement. "So you do know English?" Why, yeah," Izuku responded, rather lamely in his opinion. The girl didn't seem to mind though, as she was busy bouncing up and down happily. "This is great," she cheered. "I was really hoppin' there was someone in my class that knew English. Learning Japanese sucks." Izuku didn't say anything, out of a mix of surprise and fear of embarrassing himself even further, allowing the girl to ramble on and on in her native tongue. "Oh shoot, where are my manners? My name's Pony." She introduced herself with glee, still rocking back and forth on her heels with a bright smile on her face. "It's super nice to meet ya." And nice to meet you too. My name is Midoriya Izuku." He stumbled through his words a bit. He was far from an expert in the language, and with the speed and emotion Pony was speaking with it took him a moment to grasp what she had been saying. Pony gasped, hitting herself in the forehead. Oh yeah, you guys call each other by your last names. In that case, my name's Tsunotori Pony. I'm from Texas. I wanted to go to U.A., just like All Might. But I didn't realize that nobody would speak English. I kinda thought it was a universal language. And that I could learn Japanese on the fly, you know? Izuku blinked, barely hanging on to what she was saying, and still unsure exactly why she was talking to him. He was way out of his depth at U.A., where so many people were just so nice to him for seemingly no reason. He still didn't trust it. The other shoe was going to drop at any moment. So anyways, Tsunotori continued, I've been trying to find somebody else in our class who knows English, but had zero luck. The gals are cool and all, but they can't understand me half the time, and neither can any of the guys. And it gets worse. I can't even teach myself Japanese. It's just so hard. And I'm not a good teacher. And somehow U.A. doesn't have tutors for this kind of stuff. Can you believe it? Izuku's mind was spiraling. Tsunotori sure did talk a lot in one breath. What did she just ask him? No. Pony let out a sigh. Yeah, it's rough. She then locked eyes with Izuku, Prussian blue meeting emerald green, as she gave him a pleading look. You know where I'm going with this, right? Izuku did not, in fact, know where she was going with this, and so he awkwardly shook his head. Tsunotori didn't seem to be put off by his admission. In fact, it was as if it emboldened her as she grabbed Izuku by his hands. Izuku's face erupted in an absolutely massive blush the moment she touched his hands, and it only got worse once she took a step closer to him. Please teach me Japanese, she begged. Izuku was trying to respond. He really was. But every time he opened his mouth, nothing came out. Talking to people was never his strong suit, much less talking to pretty girls holding his hands while pleading for his help. He must have looked like a fish, with his wide eyes and gaping mouth. Izuku forced out, still barely conscious. Okay? Tsunotori lit up like a Christmas tree, giving Izuku a smile so bright he nearly had to shield his eyes. Which would have been an issue, given she was still holding his hands and all that. Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Tsunotori said happily, pulling Izuku in for a quick hug in the process. Izuku went catatonic. Was he dead? Was this heaven? Was U.A. just magical? Tsunotori let him go after a moment, seemingly unaware of the mental breakdown Izuku was experiencing. So, how is this going to work? It took a lot for Izuku to ground himself back in reality after that hug. It had been a long time since someone got that physical with him, at least while they weren't beating him up. It was nice. Realizing Tsunotori was still waiting for an answer, Izuku shook his head. I'm not sure. I've never tutored someone on Japanese. Did you have a place and time in mind? Tsunotori looked thoughtful for a moment, before shaking her head. Nope. My schedule is pretty flexible, and this is super important, so it'll probably be better to work around your availability. Here, do you have a phone? He nodded, shakily pulling out his phone and offering it to her. He wasn't exactly sure why she wanted it, even though rationally there was only one reason she would ask to see his phone. Sure enough, Tsunotori took it, and in one quick swipe, handed it right back to him with a new number and name in his contacts. Pony. He was happy she didn't ask about why he had so few other contacts in his phone. So just text me whenever you want to meet up, or when you have an idea on when you want to, or whatever, all right? Tsunotori asked. Thanks again for agreeing to help, it means a lot to me. Izuku could only nod dumbly as Tsunotori left the room, practically skipping past Fukudashi and Bondo, whose jaws were currently on the floor. Well, Bondo's was. Fukudashi's would have been as well if he had a jaw to drop. Dude, Fukudashi muttered. What the hell just happened? I believe Midoriya-kun just got Tsunotori-san's phone number, Bondo said calmly. I didn't understand what they were discussing, however, so I have no clue how he did so. Fukudashi shook his speech bubble as if he were shaking his head. Midoriya-kun. He rushed over to the greenette, shaking Izuku out of his stupor both literally and figuratively. Fukudashi had him by the shoulders and was shaking him aggressively. How'd you do that? It's only the second day of school. You're a legend. What? I don't know, Izuku sputtered. Dude, teach us your ways, please, Fukudashi begged, Bondo nodding sagely in agreement behind him. I want to get a girlfriend too, Izuku blushed hard. She's not my girlfriend, he denied, which caused Fukudashi to scoff in disbelief. Yeah, right, he grumbled. You can tell us all about how you wooed her at lunch. We've wasted enough time here as is. As Fukudashi dragged him to the cafeteria with Bando thankfully grabbing his bag for him, Izuku could only wonder how he ended up in this situation. Surprisingly, he didn't mind it at all. Izuku sat in his seat, simultaneously terrified and excited beyond belief for 1B's first heroics lesson. Being excited was a given. He was going to be getting his first lesson on being a hero. Who wouldn't be excited? A quick glance at his classmates told him that he wasn't alone in that mentality. Many fidgeting impatiently for their teacher, or talking in hushed whispers that did nothing to hide the excitement in their voices. But what if he wasn't good enough? His classmates had been training for what was likely their whole lives to be here. Izuku was certainly going to be playing catch-up. Each of his classmates had nearly a decade on him at minimum. And if what Bando had said yesterday was accurate, All Might might be teaching them. Izuku wondered if the man remembered him. Probably not. All things considered, All Might probably met thousands of people per day, and he was just some crybaby teenager. But Izuku would never forget that day. Can I be a hero like you? It was the only reason he was here right now, after all. Izuku tried to banish those thoughts. No reason to focus on old memories. The past was in the past. Besides, what were the odds that All Might would actually be a teacher at UA? Astronomically low, probably. That didn't stop Izuku from getting his hopes up. Heavy footsteps from down the hall, making their way to the classroom, alerted the students to a new arrival. Nerves shot. Izuku immediately went ramrod straight in his seat. He couldn't make out who it was, but he could hear a deep voice coming from the other side of the hall. Could it really be? The class awaited with bated breath as the door was flung open without a hint of effort. 𝐷 walked in, a somewhat disgruntled look on his face and a clipboard tucked under his arm. Izuku blinked. Ken-sensei, Kendo asked. Are you our foundational hero studies teacher? 𝐷 huffed, rolling his eyes. No, I am only here as a substitute for today. Your heroics teacher is preoccupied for the moment. He paused for a split second, so brief it was almost unnoticeable to the class. But Izuku caught it. 𝐷 then pulled out a small remote, quickly tapping a few buttons on it. Almost immediately the back wall shifted, allowing 20 coat hangers to drop from the ceiling, each carrying one standard UA physical education uniform. Everyone grab one and go get changed, 𝐷 ordered, and meet me outside on the field. A moment passed. No one moved, taken off guard by the sudden instruction. Well, 𝐷 barked, get a move on. That snapped the class back into reality, as everybody immediately rushed to not be the last one out of the room. A physical? 𝐷 nodded at 𝐸𝐻's question, unbothered by the fact that her eyebrow floating comically high up in the air. Yes, a physical with quirks, to be precise. He took a step back, giving the class a once-over with a critical eye. 50-meter sprint, standing long jump, long-distance run. You've done all of these in middle school. Yes. This is merely to set a benchmark for all of you, to see where you stand. The hero course at UA is extremely rigorous and will be very physically taxing. It's important to set up a proper schedule based on your current limitations, something that you will be going over with your actual foundational hero studies teacher soon. 𝐷 then pulled out a baseball from his pocket, tossing in the air a few times before speaking again. The only difference is that now, you'll be allowed to use your quirks. While raw physical prowess is valuable, this allows me to see your creativity in how you can apply your quirks in various different aspects. Shiozaki-san, think fast. Shiozaki gasped in surprise as 𝐷 tossed the baseball towards her, flinching back as her hair vines instinctively reached out and blocked her face. The baseball landed harmlessly against her torso, falling to the ground right after. Right, we'll work on that, 𝐷 muttered to himself before clearing his throat awkwardly. Shiozaki-san, out of everyone in the class you scored the highest on the entrance exam. How far could you throw a softball in middle school? Blushing slightly, Shiozaki quickly picked up the baseball. Around 40 meters, sir. 𝐷 nodded, before gesturing to a white circle painted on the ground. Step inside the ring, and without leaving it, throw the ball as far as you can using your quirk. If you take a step out of the circle, your score will be voided. Shiozaki hurried over, quickly stepping into the circle and clasping her hands together as she murmured something quietly to herself. Izuku almost thought it looked like she was praying, but he couldn't really tell. After a moment likely to figure out exactly how she would throw the ball, Shiozaki looked up, a neutral expression on her face. Immediately, her hair began to twist and writhe, growing rapidly and violently as each vine wrapped around another. creating what seemed to be a slingshot. Sure enough, 𝐀𝐦 tossed the ball into the air slightly, only for it to be snapped up by the massive braid of vine hair that sat atop her head. It started to whirl around slowly, almost like how a helicopter blade swung, before picking up speed and absolutely launching the baseball. Izuku and 1B watched in awe as the baseball flew in the air for several seconds, before it finally became too far away to follow. The clipboard 𝗏𝐷 was holding on to beeped, and 𝗏𝐷 looked pleased as he read the results. 489 meters, well done. 𝐀𝐦's expression remained neutral, but she had a small smile on her face as she rejoined the class. Izuku's and pretty much everyone else's jaw dropped. 500 meters. That was insane. How the hell was he supposed to compete with that? Holy shit. 𝗬𝗵𝗂, a boy that almost looked like a brown-haired Bakugo, muttered. That was awesome. Getting to cut loose with our quirks? Awesome. There was a general chatter of agreement from a good chunk of the class, and 𝗏𝐷's eyes hardened. Awesome, he repeated derisively, immediately cutting off any talking. Do you think this is a game? Are your quirks merely playthings to you all? Unsurprisingly, no one said anything, taken aback by the sudden change in tone. 𝗏𝐷 allowed his stare to pierce through everyone's soul for a moment more before giving up, sighing as he relaxed his posture a bit. Look, I get it. You've likely never had the chance to show off with your quirks, he began. But all of you must remember, this is a serious matter. As I said yesterday, this will not be something you can simply float through or take lightly. Being a hero is dangerous, risky work, and if you aren't giving it your all and using the utmost care, things will end badly. So do try and take this seriously. Yes. A few mutterings of agreement were heard. I said, 𝗏𝐷 repeated loudly. Try and take this seriously, yes? Yes, sensei, the class repeated, pleasing their teacher. Now that's what I like to hear, 𝗏𝐷 smirked. Let's get to it. The class cheered. Izuku gulped. Izuku was worried. And not just the kind of anxious worry he lived with constantly. He was really worried. The tests weren't difficult. Izuku had done them all in middle school, and definitely had some marked improvement thanks to the training he had been doing over the past year. But the tests weren't the issue. Every other person in the class was definitely outperforming him, all because of their quirks. Sure, he wasn't the weakest physically, but when Komori could grow giant mushrooms to bounce off of for the repeated side steps, or Kiwaro could simply hitch a ride in Shishida's shadow to get just as good a time in the 50-meter dash, or Yui could shrink the grip strength device to get more pressure on it. To put it mildly, he was screwed. Izuku tried to reassure himself as best he could. It wasn't like he'd get punished for ending up in last place, right? He was giving it his all, just like 𝗏𝐷 had said. Heck, he hadn't even said that he'd be keeping score. He definitely was. Izuku would have a target on his back for sure. It was like the universe was playing another cruel joke on him. After all those years of torment, humiliation, and agony, he finally gets a quirk, only for it to be just as worthless as, all right, that's it for the tests. Izuku was quickly shaken from his thoughts, realizing that they had, indeed, finished. His stomach churned uncomfortably, unsure of what came next. You're dismissed. Huh. 𝗏𝐷 ignored the surprised stares and raised eyebrows. As the syllabus says, you will be having foundational heroics tomorrow morning, and the day after it will be at the end of day, and repeat. I shouldn't have to say this, but please don't do anything stupid. This class will be much tougher from here on out, and I don't need one of you falling asleep in the middle of your teacher's lesson. What about our scores, sensei? A lipless boy Honuki, if memory served, asked. Most of us thought we would get to see how well we did. 𝗏𝐷 rolled his eyes. The only reason you'd be shown your scores is to arbitrarily see how you did in comparison with your classmates. And that's unfair. All of you are different people, with different strengths and weaknesses, and different quirks. I'll keep these scores, as well as those from other exercises you do throughout the year, but only to compare your growth against yourself. Understood? Honuki, and most of the class for that matter, just nodded quietly. Good. 𝗏𝐷 smirked. Now, as I said, you are dismissed, but I would be remiss to not mention the plethora of after-school activities 𝐴 provides to its students. As hero course students, your options are somewhat limited in comparison to general education in terms of sports and clubs. But the gyms, library, cafeteria, and more are available to you as long as campus is open. I recommend you get familiar with them, at the very least. With that, 𝗏𝐷 turned and left the class to themselves. Most of them left as well, either alone or in their own little groups. But Izuku stayed put. "Midoriya-kun," Fukudashi called. "Let's go. Me and Bondo were gonna go get some fast food. You in?" Izuku offered them a shaky smile. I'd love to," he started. But I was actually gonna go and explore the campus like Vlad King Sensei suggested. P+, I don't really eat fast food. Sorry. It's okay, Midoriya-kun, Bondo said. No worries. Fukudashi slouched over dramatically. Oh, man. You gotta be down for next time though, okay? Izuku hastily nodded. Next time, for sure. Alrighty then, see you tomorrow. And with that, Izuku was alone. Idly, he let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding in. It hurt to say no to Fukudashi and Bondo, but he'd been through this sort of thing before. He liked them, and truly did hope they wanted to be his friends, but he had to play it safe for now. He wasn't going to let his guard down so easily anymore. Besides, he truly did want to explore the campus. He was hoping he could find the library. It would be a great spot to start writing new entries in his notebook for his classmates, not that he'd ever show anyone. Izuku, just like the rest of the class, was understandably excited to finally see who their foundational hero studies teacher would be. To be fair, half the class had already met up with some students from 1A and learned about exactly who their teacher was already. But they were still pretty nervous. It wasn't every day All Might became one of your high school teachers. However, Izuku hadn't heard this information yet, and so he was still rather skeptical of the idea. That was until he heard that all-familiar laugh echo from the hallway. Ha ha ha! A thunderous voice echoed through the room, despite the speaker seemingly being far away. I am here, coming through the door like a normal person. As if he was carried in by a tornado, All Might practically flew into the room, papers and pencils flying everywhere from the whirlwind his speed created. Izuku's and several of his classmates' hair fluttered in the sudden breeze, undoing all the effort he had put into combing his hair earlier, not that there would have been a noticeable difference anyway. Hello, students of 1B, All Might greeted. I am All Might, and I am your foundational heroic studies teacher. Silence was all that greeted the legend. Whether it be out of surprise, awe, or in Izuku's case, reverence, no words were spoken as the symbol of peace introduced himself. It was almost unreal. All Might didn't seem fazed, merely allowing his heroic grin to slip into more of a sly smile, as though he was used to this sort of interaction happening. It is nice to meet all of you as well, he laughed jovially. But I believe it is time to get down to business. Just like yesterday with Vlad King and the gym uniforms, All Might gently completely crushed a button on his remote, and 20 numbered cases immediately descended down onto the back wall. Their hero costumes. The class gasped in anticipation. Ha, All Might chuckled. I remember when I was in your shoes, zygotes. Now, who's ready to put those costumes to the test? Cheers immediately rose up in agreement as everyone ran to grab their case. It seemed that was all he needed to say to rouse the class from their stupor. Izuku hung back a bit, not wanting to get trampled. Wonderful, All Might's grin was nearly blinding at this point. Then I shall see you all at ground beta, you have 10 minutes. With that, All Might disappeared in a gust of wind, similarly to how he entered, leaving 1B with their costumes and some ruffled uniforms. It was quiet for a moment, with everyone trying to grab their costumes at the same time. But eventually it calmed down enough for Shishida to make a rather astute observation. Did All Might ever specify where ground beta was? Everybody froze. A new mad dash was started, this time for the door. Izuku remained in his seat, having memorized the layout of the U.A. campus the moment he had received his acceptance letter. He had wanted to at least tell Fukudashi and Bondo how to get there, but they were some of the first out of the classroom. He sighed, finally standing up and grabbing the lone briefcase still hanging up. Oh well, at least he'd be able to get changed in peace. As nice as it was to not have to deal with anyone else while he was changing, Izuku forgot a key detail in his strategy. If he was alone in knowing where to go, it meant he'd be alone with All Might while everybody else was lost. Him. Alone. With All Might. Izuku realized this issue at precisely the moment he arrived at ground beta, coming to a complete stop mid-step and nearly tripping over himself. Maybe he could hurry back and wait for someone else. It didn't look like All Might had seen him. Young Midoriya, looking sharp, or not. Izuku went ramrod straight as All Might addressed him, just as incapable of reacting normally to the man as he was 10 months ago. His mouth opened and closed for a moment, mind running a mile a minute as he attempted to figure out what to say, before he gave up and let his brain run on autopilot. Thank you, All Might Sensei. His costume wasn't anything special. It was just a dark green jumpsuit, with padding around his arms, legs, and vitals. He had matching red steel-toed boots, and a belt that was filled to the brim with medical supplies and other common-use items a hero might need, like rope, a flashlight, and the like. His gloves were especially bulky, meant to be able to take cuts and slashes while receiving minimal damage. It gave Izuku some actual form of defense beyond hoping his padding would keep him alive. And of course, he had a mask with a built-in respirator and bunny ears that made him look like a baby version of All Might. All Might nodded, that ever-present grin shining bright as ever as he stared down the blatant imitation of himself. There was a small chance he didn't realize, of course, but he was the #1 hero. There was no way he couldn't discern some blatant fanboyism, especially since he looked like he was holding back a laugh. I'm glad to see you made it to you. Young man, All Might continued, voice taking a slightly lower pitch. I knew that boy I met in that alley 10 months ago was destined for heroism. Izuku froze. So All Might did remember him. He didn't know if that was a good sign or not. Well, Izuku stammered out. It's all thanks to you, sir. All Might just laughed. No, my boy, I'm pretty sure the one to thank for your being here is you. I wasn't the one who put in the work to be here. Izuku wanted to disagree, but who was he to argue with All Might? That would be like arguing with God for him. Actually, scratch that. That was arguing with God for Izuku. All Might opened his mouth to say something else, but paused. It seems like your classmates are finally arriving, young Midoriya. Mind if we postpone this conversation for another time? Izuku blinked. All Might wanted to talk more with him. What had he done to warrant that? Realizing the man was still waiting for an answer, he quickly shook his head. And not at all, sensei. With that, All Might turned to his newly arriving class. But Izuku felt like the man's attention was still on him. What had he done to deserve such a blessing? Nice costume, Midoriya-kun. Izuku turned to see Fukudashi and Bando approaching him, along with what looked like everybody else from 1B. How'd you get out here so quickly, man? Fukudashi questioned. You must have known the school's layout or something. This place is a maze. Izuku laughed awkwardly. I must have just gotten lucky or something. He trailed off, unsure of how to respond to Fukudashi's rather accurate accusation. Your costumes look cool too. Fukudashi lit up, literally. A light bulb appeared in his speech bubble, and it was so bright Izuku and Bando had to squint to see it, even through his comic panel mask. Thanks. I couldn't think of anything to add that actually supports my quirk, but at least it looks unique. Bando nodded in agreement. Thematically, I like how my costume looks, but I wish I had a bit more in terms of support gear. Samedin doesn't really have much need for that sort of thing, though. Izuku bit his cheek. He could easily think of half a dozen different pieces of support gear for Bando alone, and Fukudashi was a whole different story. But who wanted to hear criticism on their costume, let alone from him? It'd be better to keep his mouth shut, especially if he was wrong about some of his assumptions. Midoriya definitely looks the most badass out of us three, Fukudashi pointed out. If it weren't for the bunny ears, you might look kinda scary. Izuku flinched, but didn't disagree. Even when he was designing his costume, he didn't really like the colors, but they were the best options when it came to hiding bleeding. Well, they say the clothes make the man, ladies and gentlemen, All Might announced, immediately drowning out all other conversations. And I must say, you all certainly look like heroes. Cheers arose once again, with most of the students fawning over each other's costumes, before All Might put up a hand to silence them. Now, he chuckled. You'll have plenty of time to discuss your looks later. For now, it's time to discuss your assignment today. All Might paused, allowing the students to look around nervously between each other as the tension slowly mounted. Battle trials. You heard me right, zygotes, All Might declared, pulling out a fish bowl, with a bunch of small slips of paper inside it. Battle trials. The best way to get a feel for how things work in the big leagues is to get some real experience fighting. Here's the scenario. A team of villains has secured a fake bomb inside of this ordinary office building, and the heroes must hurry to either incapacitate the villains or touch the bomb to deactivate it. The villains win by either successfully defending the bomb for the duration of the round, or by capturing the heroes. Each round is 15 minutes, with 2 people per team. Any questions? Immediately, a slew of hands rose up. All Might was unfazed, however, and began calling names out and answering in rapid-fire succession. How will teams be picked? Using this fishbowl, I shall randomly pick 2 names. Are the villains allowed to touch the bomb and move it? Yes, the villain team can do anything they want with a bomb, seeing as they would theoretically have an understanding of how it works. Why are we fighting inside a building? Don't most villain fights happen outside in the street? Without thinking, Izuku opened his mouth at that question. Actually, most villain fights, or at least those that involve the highest-ranking villains, usually occur inside. It allows for heroes to cut loose and not worry about the prying eyes of the media during a fight, and for villains to control the fight to an extent, depending on what sorts of quirks, traps, and weapons they have at their disposal. A beat passed, and Izuku suddenly realized that every pair of eyes was suddenly on him. Immediately, he turned beet red and opened his mouth to apologize, but All Might's booming laugh beat him to it. You hit the nail on the head, young Midoriya. While it's true that many villain fights do occur in broad daylight, young 𝐻𝐻𝐸, only the truly dastardly will fight indoors. It's those villains you have to be on the lookout for, not the petty thief who will fight when cornered. How badly are we allowed to beat up our opponents? All Might tensed up at that one, narrowing his eyes at 𝐀𝐦. There is a fine line between fighting to train and fighting to harm others, young 𝐀𝐦. I suggest all of you understand that. His voice was heavy and firm, unyielding as he seemingly looked the entire class in the eye at once. Yesterday, there was an incident involving excessive force in Class 1A. I will not tolerate another. The air was thick. Izuku held his breath, not wanting to make a single noise. The rest of the class was similarly quiet. But I trust all of you to not make that same mistake. All Might finished brightly, causing most of the class to breathe out a sigh of relief. Now, for the teams. All Might clumsily held out the fishbowl, allowing each student to have a turn plucking out a small piece of paper with a letter on it, signifying what team they would be on. Although Izuku was practically trembling with nervousness by the time he got close enough to All Might to take his slip, he was coherent enough to not make a fool of himself and grab it without incident. He took a look at his folded-up piece of paper and opened it up to find a large F staring back at him. If that wasn't a sign from the universe, Izuku didn't know what was. Hey, someone shouted from the crowd. Who's got an F? Izuku flinched involuntarily at the noise, and the fact that that person would be his partner. His eyes darted over to the boy who had yelled, coming face to face with one 𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧 as iron overalls. They were pulled up to his pecs, and metal suspenders held them up around his shoulders, coming together around the big red button on his chest. He also had what looked like silver combat boots, but that was it. Izuku wondered if there was some dress code rule that ordered hero students to wear a somewhat revealing costume that he missed. It wouldn't shock him, at this rate. "You got an F?" Zetsu questioned loudly. It took all of Izuku's meager willpower to not flinch away, and he merely nodded as he showed the steel student his paper. He nodded stoutly and turned back towards All Might. Izuku breathed out a sigh of relief once the boy's strong gaze wasn't on him, and allowed himself to focus on the number one hero once more. "Now then," All Might continued, "now that you all have your teams, it's time to select the matchups." A ripple of excitement went through some of the students at that one, including Zetsu. Izuku grimaced. He hoped the boy was okay with doing most of the work. First up, Team F as the heroes and Team A as the villains. Shit. Izuku's eyes darted around nervously, scanning for who their opponents would be. If it were someone like Fukudashi or Yanagi, he might have a shot against them. But if it were Kamakiri, stared down Zetsu and Izuku, easily having picked them out from the other side of the group. His insect-like mandibles twitched, and Izuku gulped in fear. Shishida stood next to him, eyeing them up in a similar manner, albeit not as intensely as Kamakiri was. Double shit. Kamakiri and Shishida were two of the strongest in the class, at least if what he had seen during yesterday's quirk physical was any indicator. Zetsu didn't seem like much of a slouch either, which left poor little Izuku as the obvious weak link on the team. "Here are your building schematics, gentlemen." All Might quickly swooped by all four of them, dumping a handful of papers and blueprints into each of their arms. "Villains, go to the building and figure out where you're going to place your bomb. Heroes, you have 10 minutes to plan. Use them wisely." Izuku nodded, but with how anxious he was you'd think he was having a seizure. He probably wasn't that far off of one, at any rate. "So," Zetsu trailed off, "what's the plan?" Izuku squeaked like a stuffed animal. What? 𝗧𝗧𝗧 rolled his eyes. The plan. What are we gonna do to win? Izuku was confused. Was his teammate telling him to make a plan or asking him to strategize? Well, maybe we should come up with one together. What's your quirk? Nah. 𝗧𝗧𝗧 shot him down immediately. I'm kinda dumb. And you're really scrawny and didn't do all that well in the physical yesterday. But you're still in the hero course. So I gotta guess you're really smart to make up for that. Izuku blinked, taken aback. Was that a compliment, an insult, or both? Anyways, the steel boy continued, a savage grin on his face. My quirk's called Real Steel. It lets me turn my entire body into steel, or just parts, or whatever I want. Pretty metal, huh? Izuku nodded. That was a powerful quirk. It almost made him kind of jealous. Well, he mumbled. If you want me to make a plan, then sure. Based on the schematics we were given, the buildings have 5 floors, with over 24 rooms per floor. It would be impossible to clear out every room given the time limit of 15 minutes, so it makes sense to try and rule out some things. The first and last floors are almost guaranteed to not have the bomb placed there, considering how obvious of a spot they would be, and we can likely cut out the second floor as well since it would take us no time at all to find it. That leaves us 2 floors to search, which is doable, but not ideal since there are still a ton of rooms to search, and we're more likely than not going to have to fight Kamakiri and Shishida. Kamakiri's attitude might work as an advantage for us, however, seeing how he looks like he was hunting for a fight, so maybe. 𝗧𝗧𝗧 slapped him on the back, enough to shake him out of his mumbling spree. Dude, what the hell are you saying? Izuku's face flushed. Here he was, mumbling again like a weirdo to someone he barely knew. He was such an idiot. Nothing, Izuku muttered. Sorry. 𝗧𝗧𝗧 ignored him, focusing his attention towards the building they were about to clear. So do you got a plan or what? Izuku was quiet for a moment, before finally nodding. A small smile made its way onto his face, but it was thankfully covered by his mask. Yeah, I think I do. And the hero team has entered the building. All Might announced over the intercom. The match has begun. Heroes, your 15 minutes starts now. 𝗧𝗧𝗧 gave him a sideways glance. You sure this will work? Maybe, 𝗧𝗧𝗧 shrugged. Whatever. If we lose, it's on you. Izuku gulped and took a seat on the floor. 𝗧𝗧𝗧 followed. A minute passed. Nothing. 2 more. Nothing. Another minute. Izuku was starting to think he might have made a mistake. Nuff. Tip, 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 tip. Above them, someone was clearly running down the halls, making their way to the stairs. And fast. 𝗧𝗧𝗧 stood up with a savage grin, clanging his ironclad fists together, even as Izuku pulled himself into the nearest empty room. He slammed it shut as soon as he could, before pressing himself up against the wall. With any luck, he'd get his signal. A few seconds later, Kamakiri practically flew down the hall, enraged. There you fucking are, he snarled. What the hell are you two doing? You know you have to fight us, right? And where's the green kid? 𝗧𝗧𝗧 scoffed. Nice try, villain, he goaded. But today your opponent will be me. I shall best you with the power of real steel. Izuku held back a facepalm at 𝗧𝗧𝗧's acting, but it did the trick nonetheless. I'll show you steel. Kamakiri took the bait hook, line, and sinker. Eat blades. In a whirlwind of swords and axes, Kamakiri rushed at 𝗧𝗧𝗧. The steel hero barely had time to harden his skin before Kamakiri was upon him, sparks shooting out across his body as metal met metal. 𝗧𝗧𝗧 was tough, but Kamakiri was relentless, slowly pushing him back towards the entrance of the building. However, Kamakiri was completely focused on 𝗧𝗧𝗧, exactly what they wanted. Izuku snuck up behind Kamakiri quietly, capture tape in hand. It would only take 1 moment and Izuku tackled Kamakiri right, as he was poised to deliver a downward slash across 𝗧𝗧𝗧's torso. The boy was taken completely by surprise, so much so that he was unable to resist as Izuku pulled the capture tape tight around his torso. Kamakiri has been captured, All Might announced. The hero team has 8 minutes left. Fuck, Kamakiri sneered. What the hell was that? 𝗧𝗧𝗧 smirked, raising his hand into the air. You got played, up top, Midoriya, Izuku blinked. What did he mean by that? Come on, dude. Don't leave me hanging. Oh, 𝗧𝗧𝗧 wanted him to give him a high five. When was the last time he'd given a high five to someone? Izuku had to jump. 𝗧𝗧𝗧 was tall, and he was the second shortest boy in the class, but hit 𝗧𝗧𝗧's waiting hand with a resounding smack. Now let's go get that bomb. All right. "Hey!" Kamakiri shouted from the floor. "What about me?" Alas, he was ignored, with Izuku and Zetsu already running towards the stairwell. "Assholes." "So," Zetsu breathed out. "What now? We got, like, 4 floors to search?" Izuku shook his head, panting as he rested his hands on his knees. "No. We would have heard Kamakiri sooner if he had started on the 2nd floor. And the 5th floor is too obvious, in a manner similar to how the 1st would have been. That leaves the 3rd and 4th floors, and there is an obvious choice between them to start from." "What?" Zetsu was lost. Izuku didn't blame him. He sighed. "Based on a lot of math laws and probability and randomness junk," he hurried to explain, "there's a much better chance they chose a room on the 4th floor. We need to hurry and clear them together, since one of us alone could easily lose to Shishida and leave the other out of luck." Zetsu nodded. "Doesn't make sense to me, but it doesn't need to." They hurried, rushing from door to door as quickly as possible, but there were a lot of rooms. It was boring and monotonous, leaving some room for talking. "So," Zetsu asked in between slamming doors open, "what's your quirk? You never told me." "I didn't," Izuku wondered aloud. "Oh, sorry. It must have never come up. It's nothing special, and isn't exactly well suited to this exercise." Zetsu raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Oh, then I don't care." "Huh," Izuku blinked. Zetsu shrugged as he kicked down another door. "Yeah, I was only asking because I wanted to know if we needed it to win. I don't really care otherwise." Okay, then." Zetsu was very honest, if nothing else. Izuku could respect that. Speaking of Zetsu, Izuku jerked his head over towards his teammate as he threw one final door open in victory. "Found the bomb?" Izuku smiled. "Nice." A low chuckle caused both the heroes to freeze. "Took you long enough, gentlemen." Inside the room, standing alone in front of the bomb, was Shishida. His hairy chest exposed for the world to see. Why were so many of his classmates' costumes so revealing? "Don't get him started on some of the girls." Burly arms crossed in front of them. "I see you took out my comrade," he sneered. "But the road ends here. For I, the great evil beast from the east, shall defeat you." Zetsu burst into laughter, falling to the floor as he held his sides in pain. Dude, what the fuck?" he wheezed, cackling like a madman. The beast of the east?" Shishida looked offended. "It is my villain name for this exercise," he shouted angrily, before pushing his glasses back into position. Speaking of, Izuku could only watch on in horror as Shishida began to grow and grow, limbs stretching and widening at an alarming rate, until Shishida stood several heads above both of them. He snarled angrily, like the two had disturbed his nap. "Be gone," Shishida howled, "or face your doom." With that, Shishida slammed one monstrously large hand down. Izuku yelped and hurried to dodge, barely avoiding sharing Zetsu's fate of being sent crashing down to the floor below. Triple shit. "Ack!" Zetsu screamed, before being muffled by the sound of concrete and metal creaking inwards to fall on top of him. "I'll be right back up there, Midoriya. Don't get caught." Easier said than done, Izuku thought. Shishida turned towards Midoriya with a dark grin. "Care to surrender?" he offered snidely. "Or would you like to share the same fate as Hey? What are you doing?" Izuku had burst into a sprint the moment Shishida began to fall into a monologue again, desperate to end the match quickly. All Might had announced that they only had 5 minutes a good while ago, and who knew how long it would take Zetsu to get back. The bomb was only a few meters away. If he was lucky, he could get to it. Shishida snatched him up in one huge hand, crushing his hopes immediately. "A valiant effort," he boasted. "But unfortunately, the road ends here." Yeah, right. Izuku had come this far. He wasn't about to give up. He was really close to giving up. His body was squeezed tightly into Shishida's hand, but his arms were still free. He had one chance to do something, anything, to distract Shishida, and he had to act quickly. He grabbed onto a handful of hair on Shishida's arm, took a deep breath, and yanked with all his might. "Yoich!" Shishida yelped, reflexively dropping Izuku onto the ground. "That hurt, hero." Izuku wasted no time in running straight at Shishida, who looked at him weirdly, but nonetheless readied himself for a fight, until Izuku slid between his legs and hopped onto his back. "What the get off of me?" Shishida growled. "This is unbecoming of a hero." Izuku said nothing, too busy trying not to be bucked from Shishida as he began to reach around his back for the small boy. He had to move around a lot, which was hard, doubly so with the way Shishida was jumping around trying to get him to lose his grip, shaking the building by its foundations, but was relatively safe. At least until Shishida slammed his back against the wall. Izuku let go with a gasp, his body going limp as he was crushed between the two. He fell to the floor limply, causing Shishida to wince. "Apologies, Midoriya-san," he tried. "I did not mean to hurt you in such a manner." Izuku gasped for breath, the hit having knocked all the air out of him. He shook his head to the best of his ability. I'm okay." All of a sudden, the door flew open again to reveal Tetsu completely covered in dust and plaster. "I'm back," he shouted, immediately throwing himself at Shishida. "And I'm not about to lose," Shishida scoffed. "Your partner is incapacitated, and you are so tiny. What hope do you have to stand against me?" Tetsu blinked. "What do you mean? Midoriya's fine." Shishida turned in a panic, and sure enough, Izuku had pulled himself up just in time to throw himself into the side of the thankfully fake bomb. "The hero team has secured the bomb," All Might announced. "The hero team wins. Please return to the viewing room for evaluation." "Hell yeah," Tetsu whooped. "Nice going, Midoriya," Izuku nodded, leaning back against the wall again as Shishida shrunk back down to normal. "Do you need assistance, Midoriya-san?" the bespectacled boy offered. "I truly am sorry about that hit." Izuku shook his head again. I'm fine, just give me a sec, whoa." Tetsu shook his head, lifting Midoriya up and over his shoulder. "You heard All Might. We gotta get going." But you don't need to carry me," Izuku shrieked. Tetsu just laughed, Shishida following them with an odd look on his face. Izuku and Tetsu were swarmed by their classmates the moment they returned. But All Might was thankfully to return everyone to attention before an uproar broke out. "So," All Might began, "can anyone tell me who the MVP of this match was?" Several hands shot up immediately, to All Might's surprise and joy. "Let's hear from you, young 𝐬𝐻." "It was Tetsu, right?" 𝐬𝐻 answered proudly. "He was the one who took on Kamakiri and distracted him from Midoriya to capture him, and did pretty much the same with Shishida." "No way," Tetsu protested. "It was totally Midoriya. He came up with the plan to get Kamakiri alone and figured out which floor the bomb was on through sheer guesswork, and he got the bomb. He should be MVP." "I agree," All Might nodded. While young Tetsu was very efficient in his execution of their plan, it was young Midoriya who was the brains behind the operation and secured their victory. "Very well done to both sides, regardless." "Very well done my ass," Kamakiri hissed quietly. "We got creamed." All Might gave him a fond look. "That may be so, young Kamakiri, but fret not. This was just an exercise, and your first one at that. No one is perfect. There will be plenty of time for you to learn from your mistakes today and grow." Kamakiri still looked a little pissed, but seemed to accept All Might's explanation with a nod. At least he didn't look like he wanted to kill Izuku if this was Bakugo. There was no doubt Izuku would have been turned into a red stain on the ground by this point. "Anyways," All Might continued, "our next match is Team C as the heroes and Team B as the villains. Get into your positions, using the next building over young Shishida, did a number on the last one." With that dismissal, Yanagi, Tsubaraba, Kaibara, and Kanoko all stood and hurried to the door, leaving Izuku alone, with a bunch of his classmates who were looking at him weirdly. "Great. Hey, Parsley." Izuku instinctively turned to his left to see who addressed him in such an odd way, only to see nothing but a floating head with sharp teeth and long green hair. He screamed, jumping like a cat that just had a bucket of ice water dumped on him. The head cackled, even as another student began to admonish it. "Oh, man, that was too easy. Sorry about that, Parsley, but the opportunity was too good to pass up. The name's Takage Setsuna, but you can call me anytime Tilda." "Takage-san." Another greenette admonished. Why were there so many people with green hair in this class? That is no way to greet a fellow classmate. "Aw, come on Ibara," Takage moaned. "It was so funny." Fukudashi cackled in agreement from beside Izuku, an XD emoticon taking up his speech bubble. "It really was." Izuku gulped as Takage, Shiozaki, and the rest of his classmates began to introduce themselves and started to pester him and Tetsu with questions about their victory. He smiled. Either way, it was nice to be on the receiving end of praise for once, even if some of his classmates were rather eccentric. Oh well. Anyone was better than Bakugo. Izuku stared at the mob of people gathered around 𝐸's entrance nervously, wondering just how he was supposed to make it through the mass of news reporters. He didn't really want to interact with any of them, so waiting until they left seemed like a smart move, but he had been doing that for the past 30 minutes to no avail. A few students had gathered their courage and simply tried to walk through the conglomerate to mixed results. But Izuku was sure that wouldn't go too well for him. Midoriya-kun? Izuku was proud of the fact that he only jumped a little bit at the surprise at being called out. Quickly turning around to see 𝐀𝐦 Kendu offered him a bright smile and wave as she walked up to him. Hi, good morning, Midoriya-kun. Izuku's attempt at a smile was much worse than hers was, shaky and forced as he realized he was alone with a girl from his class. A very pretty girl at that. Likewise, he tried. Kendu hummed, running a hand through her orange ponytail as she looked over at the crowd of people still pushing to get into you. Hey. What's up with that? Izuku shrugged lamely. I'm not sure, to be honest. I tried getting past them, but they just started asking about All Might and what it's like having him as a teacher. Kendu made a face, wrinkling her nose at the reporters. Well, that's just peaky, isn't it? They really aren't gonna budge then, huh? Izuku shook his head. Kendu stared at the mass for a few more seconds until she snapped her fingers, a light bulb seemingly going off in her mind. I've got a plan, Midoriya-kun, she said, a devious smile on her face. Are you ready? Are ready for what? Whoa. Kendu lightly grabbed him by the wrist, making his face explode in pink. She began to drag him towards the crowd, growing her free hand to its larger size while doing so. Out of my way, she shouted at the crowd, waving her hand around to shoo any unsuspecting news crews out of the way. He needs a doctor. What? Izuku involuntarily made a strange choking sound that really hammered home Kendu's act, causing her shouts to quicken as she urged, ordered, and shoved people out of their way as they approached his entrance. Once they reached the gate, an incredibly irate 𝐸𝐴𝐻 quickly ushered them inside before any other reporters could try and sneak in. Mercifully, Kendu let go of his arm right away, a sheepish look on her face. Sorry about that, she apologized. But I didn't want to be late, you know. Besides, it worked really well. Izuku just focused on taking deep breaths, trying not to lose his mind at the embarrassment and surprise exercise he had just faced. It's fine, he wheezed. Don't worry about it. Kendu still looked a little guilty, but shook her head quickly to dispel any lingering embarrassment. All right, cool, she exclaimed, quickly turning on a heel and walking towards the building. Come on, Midoriya-kun. We don't want to be late for homeroom. Izuku blinked, before dumbly realizing that Kendu was actually waiting for him. All right. He hurried to catch up to his classmate, who was waiting for him patiently. Once he reached her, they began to slowly make their way to 1B. Izuku breathed out a sigh of relief as the disaster that was this morning seemed to finally be ending. Surely nothing else bad would happen today, right? Class representatives, 𝐷𝐷 nodded. Yes. By the end of homeroom, I expect the names of a class representative and vice representative on my desk. I'll leave it up to all of you on how you want to pick, whether it be a vote, asking me to select them, drawing straws, whatever. Just know that the representatives you select will be the leaders of Class 1B for the next 3 years. With his little spiel finished, 𝐷𝐷 sat down behind his desk, content to observe as the class burst into chaos. Make me class representative. Izuku wasn't sure who said that line, but there were at least a half dozen other screams along that line that drowned out any semblance of maturity. Oh well, Izuku wasn't exactly raring to throw his name in the ring. He was more than happy to let someone else take a spot at the top of the class. It wasn't as if people would want him as a representative anyways. A resounding clap echoed through the room like thunder, immediately putting a stop to all the chatter. Kendu stood at the front of the room, hand enlarged, glaring down at the class with a downright scary look in her eyes. Enough, she shouted, despite the fact that the class had quieted immediately following her clap. Look at you guys. Are you really gonna sit here and scream about wanting to be class representatives? We're all training to be heroes, act like it. A few of the particularly loud students mumbled out apologies to Kendu and 𝐷𝐷, but most of them were waved off. Now then, Kendu said with a smile, clapping her normally sized hands together, and wasn't that scary? How she shifted her tone so quickly. How do you guys want to pick class representatives? Most of the class seemed to have been muted following Kendu's reprimand, but Shishida tentatively raised his hand. How about a vote, he offered. Whoever gets the most votes will become class representative, and second place will be the vice representative. That way, we can choose from ourselves those who we feel are best representative of the class. Kendu shrugged. Sure, but how will we keep people from voting for themselves? Just let them, 𝐷𝐷 wondered aloud. It's not like you can't vote for yourself in real life. After all, Kendu hummed. Ken-sensei, can we have a few pieces of paper for everybody to write their vote out on? 𝐷𝐷 nodded. tossing her a stack of blank pages, watching intently as she began to hand them out to the class. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 accepted his gratefully, before turning his attention to the page, mind racing. Who did he want to vote for? Obviously not himself, that was for sure. 𝗏𝗏𝗏 had clearly wanted the position if the way he had thrown his hands in the air and began shouting was any indicator. But was he really the best person for the job? Probably not. He was his friend and a cool guy. But 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 thought he might get bored of it too easily. 𝐵𝑃𝑃𝗀 didn't seem to show any interest in it either, so he could be crossed off the list. Who else was there? Shiozaki seemed polite and well-mannered, but he didn't know her very well beyond her introduction to him yesterday. 𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗏, 𝐻𝐡𝐚𝐧𝐼, and 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐾Amakiri were out. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐾Amakiri sort of scared him, and 𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗏 and 𝐻𝐡𝐚𝐧𝐼 both seemed like the antithesis of what a class representative would stand for. Kendo was a possibility. She was nice to everyone from what 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 had seen, and was pretty good at keeping everybody in line apparently. But Shishida had come up with the idea of voting to choose a representative, and seemed very much so interested in the job. Plus, during the battle trials yesterday, he had taken the time to check on him after he was slammed into the wall. That had to count for something, right? His mind made up. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 quickly scribbled down Shishida's name before hurrying over to the small pile of papers that had begun to form on Vlad King's desk. Once he dropped his down, he simply waited for the rest of the class to finish up, which didn't take very long. Vlad King eyed the list of papers in front of him, before sighing and beginning to tally the votes. Once he was done, he stood up with a huff, something that caused everyone to straighten up. "All right then, I suppose congratulations are in order," Vlad King announced. "Say hello to your representatives for the next 3 years. Kendo-san will be your class representative, while Midoriya-kun will be your vice rep. Come on up and say a few words, won't you?" "What?" 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿's body was on autopilot as he walked to the front of the classroom, and even as he turned to face his fellow students, he kept his eyes trained squarely on the back wall. His posture was a stark cry from Kendo's, who looked relatively fine with her appointment to class rep. "Well, thanks everyone," Kendo began, a sheepish smile on her face. "I'm kinda surprised you guys chose me, but I'll make sure that the trust you put in us isn't misplaced. We'll do our best to ensure that we have a great 3 years together." The class clapped politely, and thankfully Vlad King dismissed them back to their seats after Kendo's little spiel. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 was fine with not talking, still trying to figure out how he of all people had been chosen. Was today opposite day or something? Vlad King coughed into his hand, once again redirecting the class's scuttled attention back to him. "One last thing before I let you all go for the period," he finished, a more serious look appearing on his face. "I reviewed the footage from the battle trials you participated in yesterday with all might. Overall, good job for your first time sparring. A few notes, however." He began to turn towards a few of 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿's classmates as he spoke, calling out brief praises or criticisms. "Yui-san, try not to be so stiff next time, all right?" Yui nodded impassionately. "Fukudashi-kun, learn to control your nerves, or at least your screams, so that they don't bring down another building, all right?" Fukudashi gave him a salute, already having moved past the embarrassment that was accidentally screaming so loud with his quirk. A building fell down on him. He was fine after they were able to dig him up from the rubble. "Midoriya-kun." 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 tensed, already fearing for the worst. Was his plan that bad? Was he just too bad at the combat aspect? Was he, "Good work dissecting your opponents," Vlad King stated simply. "Though perhaps you should make it more digestible to your partner next time. Speaking of which, 𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗏, don't try to get out of strategizing by claiming you're just too dumb." 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. When was the last time any of his homeroom teachers spoke to him directly without reprimanding him? Not any time recently, at least. Until now. Maybe you, was different. Or more likely, it's because they don't know you. Once they know the truth, everything will go back to normal. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 shuddered as the darker corners of his mind reared their ugly head. Those thoughts were better left untouched. "Hey, congrats on getting the vice rep job," Fukudashi praised, plopping his backpack down next to him as he took a seat at their lunch table. "Didn't know you wanted it." 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 stared down at his bowl of katsudon blankly. "I didn't." Bondo cocked his head to the side. "Really? You seem like a natural second in command, Midoriya-kun. Quite intelligent, yet somewhat lacking in social skills. Standing in Kendo-san's shadow seems perfect for you." Fukudashi burst into laughter as Midoriya dropped his head against the table with a resounding thud. "I didn't even vote for myself," he groaned. "I don't know how I got the job." Bondo shrugged. For what it's worth, Midoriya-kun, I voted for you. What? Fukudashi shrieked, an exclamation point popping up in his speech bubble. I told you I wanted the job, traitor. I felt that Midoriya-kun would be more suited to the job, Bando admitted sheepishly. Sorry about that. Fukudashi huffed, flopping back grumpily against his chair. Whatever, he grumbled, before turning back towards Midoriya. Any idea who else voted for you? No way a single vote was enough to get the position. Izuku opened his mouth to respond, but was immediately cut off by the screech of an alarm. His hands shot to his ears as the blaring reached ungodly levels of noise, and he watched as just about everyone else in the cafeteria stood up and made a mad dash for the exit. He remembered Principal Nezu saying something about the alarm system during orientation based on what he could remember. This alarm signified a security breach at UA, and every student should get up, Fukudashi shouted, pulling Midoriya to his feet with one hand. We gotta get out of here. See, calm down, Izuku squeaked back, his voice nearly drowned out by the droning of the alarm. There's no point in panicking. Easy for you to say. Fukudashi yelled back. It's every man for themselves out here. You're lucky I snagged you. Izuku briefly glanced around, trying to see if he could find Bando in this mess. He was tall and particularly easy to pick out in a crowd, but for the life of him he couldn't find his friend. His eyes darted over towards the windows. Maybe Bando had been pushed all the way over there. As his eyes scanned the area, Izuku frowned as he continued to be unable to locate him. Also, he was getting shoved around pretty violently by some of the other students. That wasn't fun. Wait a second, was that the press from earlier? Izuku's mind ground to a halt. Sure enough, past the remains of what used to be UA.'s front gate stood a few dozen reporters and cameramen, all rushing towards the entrance of the school. From this distance, Izuku thought he could make out a few of them from this morning. Fukudashi-san, Izuku hissed. It's not a B break-in, it's just the press. Huh, Fukudashi shouted. I can't hear you. Izuku rolled his eyes, something he wouldn't dare to do in any other circumstances, especially not to someone who was trying to be his friend. He grabbed Fukudashi's shoulder and twisted him so that he could see out the window as well. Oh shit, Fukudashi gasped. It's just those news people again. Izuku bit back a groan. Fukudashi was something else sometimes. Fukudashi, Izuku hissed, catching the boy's attention again. Can you make an onomatopoeia that, I don't know, can drown out the sound of the alarms for a second? Fukudashi put a hand to his chin thoughtfully. Probably. Want me to do it right now? Yes, Izuku groaned. When else would he want him to do that? Fukudashi inhaled deeply, before the sound of roaring wind immediately drowned out the alarms, the screams, and every other noise that was present in the cafeteria. The 𝐓 kanji that came along with Fukudashi's onomatopoeia flew off his face, growing large enough to completely cover the alarms in the ceiling. Just like that, the cafeteria was quiet. Izuku breathed out a sigh of relief, until he realized that there were now several hundred pairs of eyes on him and Fukudashi. Fuck, come on, dude, Fukudashi whispered, nudging Izuku. Say something. Izuku opened his mouth to retort, but any possible responses died on his tongue. The whole everybody in the massive room staring you down thing was not helping much. Izuku tried to say something, anything, but to no avail. Instead, he settled for pointing out the window, where the students were treated to the same sight that he and Fukudashi had seen. As you can see, it's just the press, Izuku muttered, tapping his fingers together awkwardly. According to protocol, you all need to calm down and return to your homerooms in a calm and orderly manner. Please. A few groans rose up, but they weren't directed at Izuku. Slowly, everyone began to shuffle out of the cafeteria, no longer panicking like they were minutes before. Izuku breathed out, slouching as everyone's focus shifted away from him. Holy shit, Fukudashi exclaimed, another exclamation point appearing in his speech bubble. I can't believe that worked. Izuku sighed. And me neither. Are we really supposed to go to homeroom now? Fukudashi questioned. You'd think they'd let us go after all this. Izuku raised an eyebrow. Did you not pay attention during orientation? They went over this exact situation. Nope. Izuku bit back a groan. Of course he didn't. The moment Izuku and Fukudashi returned to their classroom, 18 pairs of eyes snapped to them. Or more accurately, 18 pairs of eyes snapped to Izuku. Dude, Tetsu shouted. That was awesome, huh? 𝗏𝗏 nodded fervently. Yeah, the way you just took control over the situation so easily was nuts. As expected of our vice rep. Shishida added with a firm nod. Izuku's face turned scarlet as more and more of his fellow classmates joined in on the praise heaping, completely embarrassed and out of his league. Something Fukudashi picked up on. "Hey," he groused, pointing an accusatory finger at the rest of the class. "What about me? I was the one who made it all quiet and stuff." "Yeah, but did you come up with the idea?" Takagi teased, waggling her finger at him as he balked. "Didn't think so." "PFFT, I still did it." Laughter ensued. And even Izuku had to hide his smile as Fukudashi took the attention off of him. After a few more moments, Vlad King walked in, eyes narrowed and face grim. The cheery mood slowly died as everyone recognized the harsh look on their teacher's face, with only a few seconds needed for the class to quiet down. Vlad King rubbed his eyes tersely. "Good job getting here, everyone. Class is dismissed." "What?" Kendo prodded. "Like we're going back to lunch?" Their teacher shook his head. "No, class is dismissed. You can all go home for the day. Classes were cancelled thanks to the press break-in." That got a reaction out of some people. A slew of shocked gasps and hushed cheers, mainly from Oase and Tsuburaba, rising up from the crowd of students. "But Ken-sensei," Shishida protested. "Why is the principal closing the school early on account of a press break-in? Surely this has happened before, no?" "No, it hasn't." Vlad King responded gruffly. "There's a big metal gate out front for a reason. Security will be getting an upgrade tonight, and Principal Nezu saw fit to dismiss all of you after what happened. You can still stay on campus, but please try not to disturb anyone." With that, Vlad King turned and marched right back out of the room, leaving the rest of the class to their own devices. Izuku craned his head to look at Tsunotori, who sat a few seats ahead of him. Sure enough, she was looking back towards him, a somewhat worried look on her face. He offered her a thumbs up to let her know that he was still on for their tutoring session, and she brightened immediately. It didn't take long for groups of his classmates to begin to head out themselves. Oase, Kaibara, Rin, and Tsuburaba shot out the door the moment Vlad King disappeared, with Kamakiri and Tetsu not too far behind. "Midoriya-kun," Fukudashi shouted, already heading for the door with Bondo. "We're out of here. You coming with?" Izuku shook his head. "I would like to, but I can't," he explained apologetically, shifting a bit so Kirawara could pass him. "I'm helping to tutor Tsunotori in English today." Fukudashi bobbed his head, waggling his now existing eyebrows. "Fair play, Midoriya-kun, fair play," he lauded, clapping slowly. "Don't have too much fun now, ya hear?" Before Fukudashi could tease him any more, Bondo grabbed him by the back of his collar. Fukudashi immediately began to protest, but it had no effect on Bondo, who simply dragged him out of the classroom. "Have a nice day, Midoriya-kun," Bondo called over Fukudashi's shrieks. "See you tomorrow." "See you." Man, he had some weird friends, huh? Not that he was one to talk. Tsunotori trotted over to him, a gleaming grin on her face. Izuku idly realized that they were the last ones in the room, a thought that nearly made him break out into nervous sweats. "Are you ready to go?" she asked, tail swishing behind her. "Yep," Izuku replied. Fair warning though, I've never tried tutoring anybody, much less in Japanese, so." Tsunotori giggled. "I'm sure it'll be fine. You sure seem to have English down pat. How hard could this be? Besides, I voted you for class rep for a reason. You got this," Izuku shrugged. "Guess we'll find out." "That's the spirit." With that, Tsunotori began to hustle down to the library, Izuku in tow. Despite the odd circumstances that had occurred around him today, Izuku smiled as he looked back on it, and looked forward to what the future held for him at UA. Too bad things were about to get really bad. Not that Izuku knew. "Hey wait, did you say you voted for me?" Shigaraki smirked as he silently crept through the empty halls of UA. It really was too easy. Just like Sensei said. A subtle tip to the press here. A hot new story about All Might teaching at UA. There, and all of a sudden, the media created the perfect coverage for him to sneak in and grab what he could. And now he had all the time in the world. It only took a few more moments to arrive at his destination, the teacher's lounge. All the info he could ever need would almost certainly be found here. Sensei knew that All Might was a teacher here already. That much was obvious. What he needed, though, was a class itinerary. Something that gave him some information on when and where All Might would be, and when he could strike. The Namu was almost ready, after all, and Shigaraki was itching to test it. All of a sudden, the shouts and alarms quieted, as though a blanket had been thrown over them. Shigaraki froze momentarily. "Did you A. Deal with the media faster than expected. Had the panic that he had woven into each of them so well been quelled so soon? Regardless, it seemed as though he would have less time than he hoped. He would have to be quick. There was no point in subtlety anymore. He scoured the room like there was no tomorrow, ripping it apart with unbridled fury, even as the muffled sound of footsteps began to slowly approach. He only had a few moments before someone discovered him, and that would ruin everything. Aha! With a wild, victorious grin, he ripped apart a binder labeled 1B. Everything he needed was in there, including a trip to one unforeseen simulation joint. How ironic. Shigaraki would make sure that something unforeseen occurred indeed. Maybe the death of the symbol of peace, for starters. Look sharp, everyone, Vlad King barked. You better be on your best behavior today. Kendo nodded sternly by his side. We've got to show our teachers that we're the better hero class. Izuku was also there, idly watching as the rest of his class loaded onto the bus. Today they had a field trip to 𝐻𝐸, something that Class 1 had apparently done a week prior to mixed results. According to some rumors that only reached his ears thanks to Fukudashi and 𝐸𝐻𝐸's unparalleled ability to gossip, their rival class had not only been very abrasive to the thought of rescue training over actual combat, 3 guesses as to who could have been behind that, but had also given their teachers quite the headache. And, of course, someone from Class 1 had apparently begun gloating over the fact that they were in the superior class. That was something that none of his classmates had taken well. Izuku didn't really care. His main concern was staying under Bakugo's radar, and that had thankfully worked out so far. If someone else wanted to be a jerk from that class, it was no skin off his back. He did wear his costume as well, though if they were going to be doing rescue training, it was the perfect opportunity for him to get some practice with first aid. Izuku clambered onto the bus last, taking the lone free seat between 𝐸𝐻𝐸 and Bondo. It was pretty lucky that he got to sit next to one of his friends, and 𝐸𝐻𝐸 didn't seem that bad either. At least not until the bus started moving. So, Parsley, 𝐸𝐻𝐸 began, laying a friendly elbow on Izuku's shoulder that immediately stressed him out to no end. What's your deal? Huh? Izuku stuttered, taken aback. What do you mean, 𝐸𝐻𝐸-san? 𝐸𝐻𝐸 smirked. Didn't I tell you to call me Setsuna? Or at least hot stuff? Izuku choked on his spit. Fukudashi howled with laughter from the other side of Bondo. Anyways, she continued, unperturbed by Izuku's reaction, I like to think of myself as a person who can read other people pretty well. You dig? Izuku nodded slowly, unsure of where she was going with this. So what I'm basically getting at is this: you're kinda weird, Parsley. 𝐸𝐻𝐸 finished, giggling at the awkward look Izuku gave her. You seem all nerdy and quiet most of the time, but then you're no stranger to taking charge, like during the battle trials and that whole lunchroom fiasco. Yui nodded stoically from across the aisle. That was hot. Izuku made a strange wheezing sound at that comment, completely out of his depth. Bondo patted his shoulder awkwardly, even as he rumbled quietly in amusement. Fukudashi had none of the same courtesies, bursting into giggles for the second time, as an XD emoticon appeared in his speech bubble. Dude, stop, he cried, holding his sides as he doubled over with laughter. I can't take it. It's too funny. Please. 𝐸𝐻𝐸 ignored Fukudashi's wailing, content to pop her head off her body, and floated directly in front of Izuku's face, making him squeak like a mouse yet again. So what's going on in that little head of yours, Greenie? She questioned again. You got 2 different people fighting over your body or something? Izuku shook his head awkwardly, slightly uncomfortable by how close 𝐸𝐻𝐸's face was to his. And not that I know of, 𝐸𝐻𝐸-san. He coughed into his shoulder, trying to avoid her curious gaze. I'm just how I am. He accentuated his statement with a weak shrug and a forced smile. But it didn't seem to satisfy 𝐸𝐻𝐸's curiosity. Maybe it's because of Midoriya-kun's quirk, Fukudashi postured, no longer afflicted with the giggles. It is a pretty weird one. Yanagi suddenly inserted herself into the conversation, humming from her spot next to Yui. It isn't unheard of for quirks to influence our personalities, she added. Although, many debates are held on whether or not quirks influence us, or the other way around. You mean our personalities control our quirks? Bondo questioned. Quirk mutations are random, are they not? Yanagi shrugged elegantly. I know not. All I am privy to is the knowledge that many researchers are exploring previously unheard of theories in regards to quirk evolution, and that many previously upheld inferences have been upended in the past few years. We're getting off topic, 𝐸𝐻𝐸 reprimanded, shifting back towards Izuku. So, what is your quirk then? I kinda assumed it was that your hair was green, or that it made you speak in mumbles. It's nothing special, he admitted, dimly aware that a good portion of the class was now interested in their conversation. It just never came up. My quirk, Fukudashi cut him off just before he could explain. Can I say it, Midoriya-kun? Bondo stared at the headless boy like he'd just grown a real face. Why do you want to reveal Midoriya-kun's quirk? Fukudashi gave an over-exaggerated shrug, rolling his shoulders. I just think it's really cool. I want to see how people react to it. Hey, Midoriya-kun, want to test it real quick? Now probably isn't the best time for that. Izuku deadpanned. They were about to go and do rescue training. What good would? We're here, 𝐷 called. Everyone off the bus. Nuts. Fukudashi snapped his fingers. It probably would have scared the shit out of everyone. Izuku flinched involuntarily at that. He hated being reminded of how awful his quirk was. Maybe it's better that we didn't, then, Bondo interjected, pulling himself up to his feet. We aren't training to be delinquents, after all. Fukudashi stuck a tongue emoji onto his face. PFT, you're no fun. They all slowly filed off the bus, entering the 𝐡𝐚𝐧𝐝 in a state of awe. The place was absolutely massive just from what Izuku could see from his spot at the entrance to the dome. There was a ruined mock-up of a city, a giant lake, hundreds of trees, and several small mountains. He wondered how 𝐴 had the budget for this. As 1B marched into the building, they were greeted by none other than the space hero. 13. All Might was also there, talking under his breath to wait. Hold on a second. All Might was here. Bondo gave him a weird look as he squealed like an 8-year-old girl. But even that didn't stop his joy from bubbling up inside him and spilling out like a bursting dam. It's All Might, he whisper-screamed. He's really here. Yeah, so? We've had class with him like 5 times already. Bondo reminded. Izuku shook his head. That's different, he argued. This is rescue training. He's gonna teach us how to save people. He eagerly looked towards his hero, only to softly frown in confusion as All Might subtly made some weird gestures to 𝐷, 𝐻 and 13, who had gathered in a circle to discuss something. Izuku didn't know what that one finger All Might put up meant. But based on the perturbed look on 𝐷, 𝐻's face, it wasn't anything good. Suddenly, 13 turned towards the class, her helmet shining brightly under the lights of the 𝐡𝐚𝐧𝐝. Where are my manners? She began. I am the space hero, 13, but most of you probably knew that already. I'm happy to welcome you all to the Unforeseen Simulation Joint, or the 𝐡𝐚𝐧 for short. She took a look out across the gathered students. I know you're all likely raring to get right into it, but please let me say one thing before we begin, or 2, or 3, or, well, no matter. As you may or may not know, she continued, my quirk is called Black Hole, and the name speaks for itself. It can attract and destroy any and all matter sucked into it, including people. The class collectively sucked in a breath. I've used it to save many people, she said fondly, as if reminiscing on all those she has helped. But it could also be used to easily kill or harm others. In our society, quirks are heavily monitored and restricted. But don't forget how easy it is to slip up and make a mistake you can't take back. Everyone was quiet, clearly unnerved by the implications of 13's speech. For his part, Izuku could only think back on all the times Bakugo had used him as quirk practice. Burns that never left, the smell of nitroglycerin, a pool of blood at the bottom of an alley. Izuku shuddered, breath shaky. He shouldn't think about that. He couldn't. But that is why you are all gathered here today, 13 finished. To learn how to control your power and use it to help others. Thank you for listening. The students clapped politely along as 13 bowed, her little speech doing wonders for everyone's understanding of the power they possessed. And then the lights flickered. Just like that, a group of people began to appear in front of the fountain in the middle of the 𝐡𝐚𝐧𝐝. They seemingly appeared from nowhere. A dark cloud had formed around the fountain, and there were dozens, if not hundreds, walking through it into the center of the 𝐡𝐚𝐧𝐝. And they just kept coming. Ken-sensei? Kendo asked. Is this a part of the training? All Might had a dark look on his face, eyes shadowed by his hair as he stared down into the plaza. No, young Kendo. This was not supposed to happen. One of the villains stepped forward ahead of the rest, with disembodied hands covering his body. He had blue hair and a black jumpsuit, but beyond that there was too much distance between them to discern any other details. 13, 𝐷, 𝐻, and All Might, huh? The armed figure said. Looks like our info was right on. Lovely. All Might stepped forward confidently, a beacon of hope for the students as he confronted the army of villains. So it was you lot who were behind the trespassing at the school last week. I'd applaud the bravery you showed if it weren't for the audacity you have to show up here. The hand-covered man, who seemed to be in charge, was content to let the rest of the villains slowly march forwards as he stayed back. Beside him, a behemoth of a man stood wearing nothing but a pair of shorts with an exposed brain. It looked like it wasn't even breathing. Izuku nearly lost his breakfast at the sight of that thing. The massive, warp gate, cloud? Whatever it was, it slowly shrunk back into itself, reforming into a smaller version of itself with narrow, yellow eyes. The blue-haired man cackled. "Oh, shut up. You may be the symbol of peace, but today Japan will learn what it's like to lose a legend. Namu, kill him." In less than an instant, the man behind the ringleader leapt into action, literally. The concrete beneath his feet cracked and broke underneath the force of his jump. Arms pulled back as he prepared to slam into. All Might launched himself into the air to catch Namu midair, stunning it briefly long enough for him to reposition and launch it into the army of villains beneath them. His impact sent shockwaves through the enemy lines, but it was barely a second before Namu pulled himself up and jumped right back up at the falling All Might. It caught the hero by surprise, and would have taken his head off if it weren't for All Might's superb reaction time, drilled into him by countless years of service. "Vlad King, with me," All Might ordered, his tone leaving zero room for argument. 13. Get the students out of here." Vlad King nodded and immediately leapt into the fray, swinging a wall of blood out and catching a handful of villains off guard, slamming them into the concrete painfully. "Let's go," 13 barked, a far cry from her peaceful tone from earlier. "We need to leave." "Wait," Komori cried, even as they started to run towards the entrance. "See, can we really leave All Might and Ken-sensei behind?" 13 shook her head. "You all are far more important. They can handle themselves. They are heroes. You are children," Kamakiri sneered, but held his tongue as he ran. By the looks of things, he'd love nothing more than to go back and help All Might and Vlad King. Around 100 meters before they reached the entrance, a dark mist appeared from the ground, reforming into the same tall cloud it had been behind the hand-covered man. "Nice to meet you," it began, rather politely for a villain, "all things considered. We are the League of Villains. It may be presumptuous of us, but we have invited ourselves to the home of heroes, U.A. High School, in order to have All Might, the symbol of peace, take his last breath. Unfortunately, I am not allowed to let you leave." 13 quickly uncapped one of her fingers, ready and willing to either kill or force the mist to move out of the way, clearing their escape, but had to stop herself as Kamakiri, Tetsu, and Awase rushed forward to attack it. "Stop," she ordered, but it was too late. A small explosion went off, but Izuku wasn't exactly sure why. A plume of smoke erupted from the center of the conflict, washing over all of them. "Did you consider that you'd get beaten by us before you did it?" Tetsu taunted, sneering up at the clouded form of the villain. The smoke cleared, and all three of them froze. Untouched, the villain stared down at them as though it was disappointed. "Oh dear, that's dangerous," it commented. "If that had hit me, it might have killed me. Quite hostile for heroes in training." "No. No," 13 shouted. "Move out of the way, you three." It was too late. The misty man briefly compressed itself, revealing a metallic brace around its neck before shooting out and wrapping around the class in 13. "My job is to scatter you all," it explained, "and let our allies kill you. Terribly sorry for the inconvenience." Izuku barely had a moment to react before the mist wrapped around him fully, whisking him away to who knows where. Izuku landed on his back painfully, all the air in his lungs leaving him briefly. He didn't have time to rest, though. He pulled himself up just in time to see a villain with a body covered in orange rocks charging at him, a nasty smirk on his face. He flinched, already accepting his fate, but nothing happened. After a moment he opened his eyes, just in time to see the ground beneath the villain liquefy. He stumbled for a moment before slipping forward, but instead of hitting the ground, it looked like his chin hit nothing. Right before the villain would have hit the ground, he froze mid-fall as though the air itself had solidified and clocked him in the chin. With the villain out cold from that hit, Izuku was given a moment to think. His eyes darted behind him to see Honuki and Tsuburaba, both looking at him worriedly. "You good, Midoriya-kun?" Tsuburaba questioned, letting the small amount of control over the air he was holding go. "That was a rough fall." Izuku nodded. "Why, yeah, I'm all right. Thanks, Tsuburaba-san." "As nice as it is to see you're okay, Midoriya-san," Honuki interrupted. "We've got bigger issues currently." Izuku looked around, and sure enough, there were a few bigger problems. namely, a few dozen villains circling around them, all eager to tear the three boys apart. He gulped and hurried over to 𝗬𝗲𝗏 and Honuki's side, all standing back to back against each other as the villains slowly crept closer. "Got a plan, Midoriya-kun," 𝗬𝗲𝗏 whispered. "We kinda need one, and that seems to be your specialty." "Gee, give me a second," Izuku hurriedly responded, brain already running a mile a second. What exactly are your quirks again?" "Be quick, please," Honuki replied, whispering. "But my quirk is called softening. It allows me to soften any non-living thing I touch in a manner similar to quicksand." "Mine is solid air," 𝗬𝗲𝗏 hissed quietly. "It lets me solidify any air I breathe out, and I can make shapes and stuff out of it that can be stood on. They're also soundproof." Izuku nodded, noting their quirks and rapidly beginning to formulate a plan. From the looks of things, they were certainly in the landslide zone. The ground was slightly shaky, and their backs were to a sheer cliffside, making escape from the villains practically impossible. Why would the warp villain send 𝗬𝗲𝗏 and Honuki, two of the students with the best control over terrain in their class, to an area focused on a lack of mobility? It was probably where they would have the best chance of survival. After all, guys, 𝗬𝗲𝗏 whispered after a few seconds had passed. "Why aren't the villains, attacking us?" Izuku froze. "It's because they don't know our quirks. They're afraid of what we could do to them." Honuki gave him a weird look. "They were able to figure out when we'd be here, and they don't know our quirks." "If they did," Izuku responded coolly, "they'd be attacking us right now, attempting to break down an air barrier 𝗬𝗲𝗏 had set up to protect us." "How'd you know I was thinking about doing that?" 𝗬𝗲𝗏 asked, head tilted to the side. Izuku ignored him, more focused on the sudden shaking of the ground as the terrain from above them began to send small rocks down upon all of them. If a big enough landslide occurred, and they could somehow protect themselves, "I have a plan," Izuku whisper-shouted, briefly causing all of the slowly encroaching villains to pause. "Honuki-san, does the stuff you soften retain its original shape once you remove your control over it? How much can you control at once?" Honuki shrugged. "If I let it rest and settle, it will. Otherwise it'll stay in whatever form it is when I let it go. As for my limit, I can stretch my control pretty far, but not much further than a few rows of those villains." Izuku took a deep breath. "Okay, soften up the cliff behind us." Honuki actually did a double take at that. "Are you insane?" he questioned. "I'll kill all of us." At that statement, the villains took a collective step back, seemingly valuing their lives more than a few dead kids. Izuku covered his mouth for this next part, unwilling to let any information about their plan loose to the villains. "Not if 𝗬𝗲𝗏 makes air platforms for us to stand on. We'll wash away the villains, but we can ride out the landslide safely." Izuku hid his smile as he watched their eyes widen in realization. "Yeah," 𝗬𝗲𝗏 muttered. "I can do that." 𝗬𝗲𝗏 looked out towards the group of villains, and then back to the cliffside. "I don't love this plan," he mumbled, "but we don't have anything better. Let's do this." "On my call," Izuku whispered, slowly raising his voice as he began counting down. 3, 2, 1, now. On his call, Honuki reached back and shoved his hand into the cliffside. A torrent of dirt and stone began to fall down, even as he pushed himself off the side and back towards Izuku and 𝗬𝗲𝗏. In a few seconds the dirt and pebbles turned into earth and boulders, and soon enough the entire cliffside was coming down on top of them. "Run!" one of the villains shouted, but it was too late for them. Earth and mud swallowed them whole as it came tumbling down, a fate Izuku and his classmates only escaped by jumping off the side of the cliff and landing on a platform of solid air 𝗬𝗲𝗏 had constructed for them. "Holy shit," Honuki gasped, laying flat against the invisible platform. "I can't believe that worked." 𝗬𝗲𝗏 nodded in agreement, unable to speak as he attempted to hold his breath and maintain the platform as long as possible. As the landslide rushed below them for longer and longer, 𝗬𝗲𝗏's face slowly turned redder and redder, the strain of holding up the platform for so long taking a toll on his lungs. Izuku and Honuki shared a worried look, but were unable to do anything except hope that the landslide slowed down enough that they weren't swept away once their platform ceased to exist. With a gasp, 𝗬𝗲𝗏 finally took a breath, and the platform beneath them immediately broke apart and dropped the trio into the thankfully mostly stopped landslide. Izuku grit his teeth as he fell a few feet onto his back again, but was otherwise worse for wear. Similarly, Honuki was all right, grunting as he liquefied the ground beneath him to form a small pool of quick mud to land in. Fuck. 𝗬𝗲𝗏 wasn't as lucky as the two of them, apparently. Izuku and Honuki rushed to their classmate's side, watching as 𝗬𝗓𝗏 gripped his left shoulder painfully, teeth grit. "Are you all right, 𝗬𝗓𝗏-san?" Honuki questioned. "What happened?" "I landed on my arm the wrong way," 𝗬𝗓𝗏 hissed. "It hurts like hell. I think it's broken." "How exactly did you land?" Izuku probed. "And have you had a broken arm before?" 𝗬𝗓𝗏 winced as he gingerly touched his elbow, giving out a muffled groan as he found the source of the pain. "I landed hand first, with my arm extended," he explained. "I felt something in my elbow crack. And yeah, I broke my arm a few years ago testing out my quirk. So what?" Izuku's stomach churned as he kneeled down to 𝗬𝗓𝗏's level, already bracing himself for the incoming pain. He hated broken bones. "Hold still," Izuku whispered gently, taking one of his gloves off as he began to roll up 𝗬𝗓𝗏's sleeve. 𝗬𝗓𝗏 gave him a weird look through his wincing. "What are you doing, dude?" Izuku gave him a pleading look, eyes full of desperation and pain. "Please don't question me. Just don't move your arm and don't freak out." And with that, Izuku reached out and grabbed 𝗬𝗓𝗏's broken arm with his one ungloved hand. Izuku thought he could handle the pain. This time he had gone through this so many times before. What was one measly broken arm compared to everything else he'd taken on? He thought wrong. 𝗬𝗓𝗏's arm must have really been broken as Izuku's right hand glowed a soft orange, spreading the light across 𝗬𝗓𝗏's arm. His left immediately began to crack and break. He wished he had a third hand to muffle his gasps of pain. It was over in a few seconds, but to Izuku it was nearly eternity. The orange light coating the inside of his hand died out once the transfer was complete, Izuku staggering jerkily up to his feet as he now bore 𝗬𝗓𝗏's broken arm. What just happened? 𝗬𝗓𝗏 wondered, unaware of Izuku's inner turmoil. "My arm feels fine now," Izuku nodded numbly. "Gee good," he wheezed. "That's what should have happened." "Did you heal his arm, Midoriya-san?" Honuki asked, eyes wide as he watched 𝗬𝗓𝗏 pull himself up with no issue. "Is your quirk simply to heal others?" Izuku's left arm laid limp against his side as he merely nodded. "More or less, yeah. Of course, that wasn't true at all." But it wasn't like Honuki and 𝗬𝗓𝗏 could see Izuku's arm through his costume and tell that it was now completely shattered the way 𝗬𝗓𝗏's was. "What an awesome quirk," 𝗬𝗓𝗏 exclaimed, throwing his arms out wide. "Why didn't you tell everyone you had a healing quirk sooner?" Izuku shrugged his one good arm. "It never came up." Honuki looked around the remains of the landslide zone cautiously, as if more villains were waiting in the shadows. "What do we do now?" "Go back to the entrance." Izuku grunted. "See if anyone made it out and contacted the school. If they haven't, it's up to you guys to do so." "What about you?" 𝗬𝗓𝗏 questioned. "It doesn't sound like you're including yourself with us there." Izuku shook his head. "I have to go and see if anyone else needs help." "You sure, Midoriya-san?" Honuki asked. "You don't look too hot." "I'm fine," he insisted. "Healing someone just takes a lot out of me sometimes. If the others are hurt, it's my job to help them." 𝗬𝗓𝗏 shrugged. "If you're positive. Stay safe, yeah?" Izuku nodded, lying through his teeth as his classmates quickly hurried back towards the entrance stairs. He just hoped that he wouldn't find any more injuries on the same level as 𝗬𝗓𝗏's. Knowing the situation his classmates were in, he doubted it. Izuku hurried through the conflagration zone, his legs carrying them as fast as he could through the destroyed false city and flames. The taste of ash in his mouth nearly made him puke, an unfortunate side effect of using his quirk. He had been through the mountain zone, having found an unharmed 𝗀𝐻𝐻𝐸 and 𝐼𝐸, as well as 𝗀𝗏 with a sprained ankle that he immediately healed before hurrying on his way. Putting any weight on it sucked massively, but he wasn't about to give up and head back towards the entrance when his classmates were out here fighting for their lives. He hoped that help came soon. Izuku wondered if All Might had defeated the large villain he had been fighting. Namu, was it? It seemed to be able to withstand at least a few of All Might's attacks, which was worrying, and the exposed brain certainly would become a mainstay in his nightmares. Normally he wouldn't have been worried. It was All Might for God's sake, and he never lost to anybody. He was the strongest hero in the world, and the symbol of peace for a reason, but the thought that the villains had come here specifically to kill him had Izuku worried. If they came to the 𝐴𝐻𝐻 to kill All Might, it meant they had a plan to do so and a belief that they would succeed. Izuku prayed that their plan failed. A split sidewalk caused Izuku to stumble, and with his next step being onto his bad ankle, he fell to the ground with a whimper. He really hated his quirk sometimes. Izuku went so long in his life without a quirk, And once he finally got one, it was the worst possible quirk a hero could have. Transfer. The ability to transfer another person's injuries to himself. Fat load it would do for him as a hero in the field. What was he gonna do? Kill himself in the middle of a fight with a villain by healing a bystander? A scream from nearby immediately cut through his thoughts. All self-loathing discarded the moment he heard it. It had come from near the center of the city, where the fire was burning the largest, and Izuku hauled himself to his feet without a second thought, even as his ankle screamed in protest. He didn't like what he found. Shiozaki stood in front of a downed Kendo, many tendrils of her hair alight with flame, as she ensnared the remaining villains and slammed them down into the pavement. Hard. There was a good chance a few of those villains didn't get up for a while. There were dozens of bodies surrounding the two, but Izuku paid them no attention as he hurried towards the girls. The moment Shiozaki had finished off the last villains, she collapsed to the ground, immediately beginning to fret over Kendo, who wasn't responding. Shit. What happened? Izuku shouted, coughing from the smoke he had been inhaling the whole way here. Shiozaki looked up in shock, eyes widening for a moment before she turned her full attention back to Kendo. Her hands were clasped around one of Kendo's own, trembling all the while. We were dropped here by that filth, Shiozaki whispered. Into this blazing inferno. Alone and outnumbered. We fought as hard as we could, but Kendo. Shiozaki choked back a sob as she stared down at Kendo's unmoving body, her orange hair dirty and splayed out behind her. As she took an attack that was meant for me, and Izuku pushed Shiozaki aside, immediately focusing on Kendo's face. He shoved his fingers under her nose to check for an airflow, and nearly cried as he realized that she was still breathing. Where did she get hurt? Izuku urged, but the answer was right in front of him. A massive slice sat across Kendo's stomach, going from her right hip to just under the left side of her ribcage. Her costume hid most of the damage, but that did nothing to hide the amount of blood that was rushing out of the wound. Fuck. This one was going to be ugly. Even so, Izuku didn't hesitate in bringing his hand to his mouth and using his teeth to rip off his glove. What in God's name are you doing? Shiozaki shrieked, watching in horror as Izuku shoved his hand against Kendo's stomach, only to gasp and go silent as that all too familiar orange light spread from his hand across Kendo's wound. Her wound closed quickly, much faster than it had taken for Tsuburaga's arm to heal, but all that meant for Izuku was that he had even less time to grit his teeth and brace himself as his stomach ripped open, letting out a strangled cry as he collapsed against the pavement. At least his costume didn't rip, sparing Shiozaki the sight of another gruesome injury. Shiozaki screamed. Kendo gasped, up and awake now that her wound had been removed. It took her a moment to reorient herself, but by then he was barely conscious. Izuku's only regret as the darkness embraced him was that he wasn't able to help more people. Izuku stumbled down the alley, hurrying to avoid any unwanted company. Today had not been a good day. Well, he hadn't been beaten up. That was a plus. What really hurt was Cat's Bakugo telling him to kill himself. It wasn't the first time one of his classmates had told him to do it, but it was the first time Bakugo had stooped so low. Despite it all, it still stung to no end to hear that from his former best friend. He pulled on his backpack straps tighter, quickening his pace. He really didn't want to get jumped on the way home. The manhole in front of him shuddered. Izuku instinctively took a step back, his nerves screaming at him to stay away from whatever that was. All of a sudden, the manhole shot up into the air, a mass of green sludge quickly erupting out from the sewer. It locked eyes, the only human thing about the mass, besides its jagged mouth, with Izuku, and grinned. A V-villain, he gasped. Well, it gurgled. What do we have here? A medium-sized invisibility cloak? It's my lucky day. Izuku tried to run, but he had zero chance to escape the monster. All it took was a single tendril of sludge to wrap around his foot, and just like that he was at the mercy of the villain. The sludge quickly began to wrap around him, attempting to shove itself down his throat. Don't worry, kid, it cackled. I'm only taking over your body. It'll only hurt for a few seconds. It'll be over soon. Izuku couldn't breathe. He desperately tried to claw at the sludge, fighting to do anything to stay alive, terror in his eyes. But it was too little, too late. Thanks, kid, you're my hero. And wasn't that just about the worst thing Izuku had ever heard? He kept trying to fight it, but it was hopeless. His chest was burning, his vision was narrowing, and he couldn't feel anything anymore. Was he really going to die like this? Have no fear, citizen. A voice boomed, reaching out to him through the darkness. For I am here. Shit. the sludge villain shouted. If I'd only had another minute. Texas smash. As though a hurricane had swept through the alleyway. The sludge immediately blew apart under the force of the Texas smash. Izuku collapsed limply to the ground, gasping for any air that he could, until he began to vomit up sludge, bile, and his lunch. All in all, it wasn't a very nice time. Are you okay, young man? That voice asked again, closer this time. Whoever it was, they sure sounded familiar. Their frame cast a shadow over Izuku's entire body as he slowly looked up to meet the eyes of his hero All Might. All Might had saved him. Izuku trembled, eyes widening to the size of saucers as he stared back at his idol and, more importantly, Japan's #1 hero and symbol of peace. All Might laughed. That's my name, all right? Glad to see you're coherent enough to recognize me. How are you holding up? Izuku tried to respond, pulling himself to his knees, but the only thing that came out was more puke. Right onto All Might's shoes. He froze, mortification at an all-time high. His trembling reached worrying levels as he realized what he just did. Izuku's breathing became staggered and quick. I'm so. All Might put a hand up to stop him. Izuku curled into himself, unwilling to hear the incoming admonishment. It is quite all right, young man, All Might said, voice surprisingly soft for someone so big as he placed a hand on Izuku's back. Just breathe. All Might handed him a brown paper bag to breathe into. Izuku didn't question where he got it to calm himself, and after a few minutes his breathing finally returned to normal. Izuku gulped and immediately regretted it. The sour taste of vomit, and the remaining sludge in his mouth, nearly making him hurl again. I'm so sorry about that. All Might, sir, do not worry, young man, All Might interrupted. It is what heroes do. Izuku nodded quietly, not minding being interrupted by his favorite person in the world. Sorry. All Might just laughed again. May I have your name, young man? All Might asked. You, Midoriya Izuku, sir, Izuku replied, before his eyes widened in alarm. Wait, what happened to the villain? All Might's grin grew even larger somehow, and he held up a 2-liter bottle of soda filled with sludge and a pair of eyes. I happened to be in the middle of shopping before I stumbled across this fiend. It turned out to work out quite well, if I do say so myself. Apologies are in order for taking so long to arrive. I do not have the sewer systems as memorized as I would have liked. Izuku nodded along dumbly, not daring to question All Might. He was still 50-50 on this being real, or him having died and gone to heaven. It's no problem, sir. Thank you for saving me. Of course. Now, do you have someone I can call for you to pick you up? All Might questioned. Or perhaps you would like to visit the hospital for evaluation. Izuku shook his head. And no, I think I'm all right, sir. Thank you. I only live a few blocks away. If you believe yourself to be all right, young Midoriya, then I suppose I must trust your judgment. All Might agreed. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to get this fiend. Wait, Izuku shouted, cutting off All Might. All Might raised an eyebrow, and despite his grin not leaving his face, Izuku suddenly felt like he'd made a mistake. Changed your mind about the hospital trip? Izuku shook his head fervently. And no, I think I'm okay, he muttered, straightening his posture. I just wanted to know. I need to ask you something. All Might shrugged, liking the spunk the small boy was suddenly showing. I've got some time to kill. Shoot. Izuku took a deep, shaky breath. It was now or never. I know I'm not strong like you, he admitted bitterly, glaring down at his own red shoes. Oh, or brave like you, or as fast, or cool. But you've always inspired me ever since I was a toddler. I wanted to be just like you. My quirk isn't useful for heroics, and no one believes in me, but I need to hear it from you. Izuku looked directly into All Might's eyes, the last dredges of his determination blazing to life in his eyes. Can I become a hero, just like you? For all the times Izuku had seen his hero, he had never seen him look surprised. Until now. A hero just like me, huh? All Might repeated airily, sitting down on the grimy curb. Kid, take a seat. Izuku did as instructed, unwilling to do anything less than All Might's exact orders, and all of a sudden he was staring at nothing alongside the #1 hero. Why do you want to be a hero, young Midoriya? All Might asked. And be honest. Izuku knew the answer in his heart immediately, but still took a moment to think about it. I'll admit, part of my wanting to be a hero is because everybody has always told me I couldn't. I want to be a hero to prove them wrong, but that's not the real reason. Izuku sighed, eyes downcast. When I was a kid, I saw this video of you. It was your hero debut in the S, I think. There was a burning building, and everybody was so scared until you showed up. Izuku smiled at the memory. You said I am here, and all of a sudden you were just everywhere, saving people by the dozens with every trip into the building. You had a smile that made everyone who saw it feel safe, and that was when I realized I wanted to be like you. I wanted to make people feel safe with just a smile, and save everybody. All Might nodded. A fine reason, young Midoriya. There are not many as altruistic as you in the world. I fear many would rather become heroes for glory or fortune. So why, as you say, does nobody believe in you? Izuku tensed up involuntarily. A slew of memories dragged to the forefront of his mind. He forced out an awkward laugh. How much time do you have? All Might smirked. As long as it takes to hear you out, young Midoriya. Well, Izuku began, as you can probably tell, I'm not exactly the strongest, or brightest, or bravest, or most outgoing person in the world. But those are just small potatoes compared to the real reason. Izuku shuddered, ready to pour his heart out to his hero. He didn't think about what he'd do if All Might rejected his pleas. He couldn't. My quirk, Izuku trailed off. It came in late. Really late. All my life I was considered a quirkless, worthless Deku, unable to do anything right. I was mocked as is, and wanting to be a hero just made it so much worse. I got laughed at in class today just for wanting to apply tea to you. He sniffled, pathetically wiping his eyes as he spilt his heart out to All Might. God, how lame could he possibly be? He gets saved by All Might, and all he can do is puke on his shoes and cry in front of his hero. Izuku was such an idiot. For the first time he could remember, All Might frowned. I'm sorry you had to go through that, young Midoriya, he said solemnly. I don't remember quirklessness being treated so harshly when I was your age. It must have taken a lot to stay so true to your dreams. But I have to ask, what is your quirk? Izuku sucked in a breath. He still hadn't told anyone about his quirk, and he certainly didn't think All Might would be the first person to hear about it. Here goes nothing. I call it transfer, he muttered. It allows me to, take a person's injuries and transfer them to my body, healing them in the process, but leaving me with their injury. All I need is to touch them with my hand to do so, but it works quicker if I'm touching their injury. It only came in about a year ago, so most people don't exactly know I have it. Toshinori was suddenly very glad that this kid didn't know about his injuries. He could not imagine a universe he wouldn't at least offer to heal his wounds. All Might was quiet for a moment, pondering his words. I see, he muttered, voice low enough Izuku nearly missed it. Chiyo would have a field day with him. Yes, sir, Izuku prodded, shaking All Might out of his thoughts. He coughed into his fist. Sorry about that, just lost in my own head. I have one last question for you, young Midoriya. Izuku straightened up. Anything, sir? All Might chuckled. Thought so. Well, it's relatively simple. How badly do you want to be a hero? Izuku answered with zero hesitation. More than anything in the world. All Might laughed. And then he stood up, clapped him on the back, and smiled. Then I suppose there is nothing I can say other than this. Izuku's heart sped up, the waterworks already beginning to burst. I'll become a hero, just like you. I'm sure you will, All Might said coolly, and call me Yagi. Toshinori Yagi. Izuku blinked away some of his tears, looking up at All Might in confusion. What? My real name, All Might admitted. But let's keep that between us, okay? Izuku nodded so quickly he thought his head would fly off. Oh, of course, sir, why Yagi-san? All Might started to laugh again, but cut it off quickly almost like there was an unseen timer going off in his head. I'd love to stay and talk more, but duty calls. I'm sure I'll see you at in 10 months, winning the sports festival. Oh, of course, sir, Izuku agreed. But, could I ask you for one more favor? All Might nodded, despite his rapidly approaching time limit. He could do one more thing for this boy. Izuku sheepishly pulled out his latest notebook. His burnt, soggy, sludge-covered notebook that Bakugo had haphazardly thrown out the window a few minutes ago. It already felt like a lifetime had passed since then. See, could you sign my notebook? Why, Yagi-san? Izuku asked shyly. All Might burst into laughter, graciously accepting the pen Izuku had offered him. Yeah, something told him he'd be seeing young Midoriya a lot more in the future. Quite the interesting prospects we have this year, no? Nezu prodded. So many different techniques on display. Information gathering to understand the situation. Mobility on a scale unseen in recent years. The discernment to stay calm under the highest pressure. And pure combat ability. What a show they're putting on for us. Toshinori nodded along absent-mindedly, slowly scrolling through screens until he found something interesting. He didn't have much luck. Most of the examinees, while tough, weren't really doing much to stand out to him. Well, that wasn't quite true. There was a certain green-haired boy All Might was keeping a subtle eye on while he observed the other students. Running around wildly, clearly focused on trying to gather points, yet abandoning all attempts at passing the exam the moment he passed an injured competitor. He looked a lot better than he did 10 months ago. And was that some muscle underneath that tracksuit? Toshinori was impressed by the kid's determination, if nothing else. Oh, Kayama gasped, a teasing smile on her face. Somebody catch your eye, All Might. Toshinori shrugged, keeping a neutral face, even as Nezu helpfully made the screen observing Izuku cover the entire interface. Just interested in this examinee, going around and helping his competition instead of focusing on gathering points. Midoriya was clearly faltering. Bruises and whelps covered his body, and there was a fair amount of blood on him. But he trucked on regardless, healing anyone and everyone who needed it and doing whatever he could for those in a bind. Nezu hummed, tapping away at some unseen keyboard. Midoriya Izuku, examinee #2839. Middle School, Aldera Junior High. Quirk, Oho. Nezu pulled up the small file he had been looking at onto the main screen as well, placing the file and the screen side by side. Midoriya's smiling face greeted the staff, even with how forced the smile looked, causing Kayama, Deku, and Toshinori to smile. But the real kicker was located in the information. Quirk. Nah, that can't be right, Ken muttered. That boy definitely has a quirk. Just look. Sure enough, Midoriya stumbled upon another examinee and began to fret over them. They had blonde hair and were holding their stomach tightly, clearly in pain. But after one touch from Midoriya and a glowing orange hand, they were as good as new. The boy bid Midoriya farewell, and just barely missed him collapsing back against the wall in pain. He held his stomach gingerly for a few moments before pulling himself back up, determined to get some points. Well, Nezu muttered, mouth a thin line. This file was last updated 2 years ago. Perhaps he is simply a late bloomer. Mutterings ran through the staff, and Nezu shared a discreet look with him. For his part, Toshinori simply shook his head. There was no way the two were related. He had crushed All for One's skull between his own 2 hands. After all, do not allow him into the hero course. Toshinori turned towards the intruding voice, but he immediately knew who it was. Why not, Aizawa? Ken grunted, eyes not leaving the screen. What good would he do as a hero? Aizawa shot back. No self-control. Goes out of his way to help civilians at the cost of himself. No apparent countermeasures to healing others at his own expense. And doesn't even have his quirk registered. What good would he be in the field? Cannon fodder. Getting himself and a civilian that he stops to help killed. Ken scoffed. Isn't that why we're here? To guide and mold the next generation of heroes? We're teachers, for Christ's sake. Aizawa rolled his eyes. I don't care what you do with him, Ken. I'm not going to force myself to go to another poor sap's funeral because he wasn't hero material. Spare me the sob story. Put him in my class, and I'll expel him. Simple as that. Ken was quiet, but there was no doubt that 1.5 million thoughts were running through his head. All Might assumed only half of them revolved around young Midoriya, the others likely focused on strangling Aizawa. He didn't blame him. Now, Nezu tutted. That's enough of that. I think it's time to see what these prospects are truly made of. All Might, if you do the honors. Toshinori nodded, eagerly pressing the big red button. Here was young Midoriya's chance. He hoped the boy didn't disappoint. And as the 0-pointer erupted from the confines of the city, Toshinori could only watch proudly as the scrawny boy he met 10 months ago went above and beyond to save a complete stranger. He took a glance at Ken. Sure enough, the man was hooked. Good. It looked like he'd be seeing a lot of young Midoriya from here on out. 𝐁𝐬 clapped his paws together, immediately silencing any and all side conversations that had been going on. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he said softly. "I hope I don't take up too much of your time today. I'm sure you all know why you're here." No responses. Good. They knew when 𝐁𝐬 was in business mode by now, and knew better than to interrupt. "Does anybody have any questions before we begin?" 𝐁𝐬 asked. Kan's hand shot up. "Unsurprising. Midoriya-kun is in stable condition," he offered. "Recovery girl is looking over him as we speak. Kuro-san is also recovering well." Ken nodded tightly in return, unable to trust his voice. "𝐁𝐬-san," Kayama began slowly. "What exactly happened at the 𝐬𝐡𝐤?" Aizawa and Yamada both leaned forward in their seats, intrigued. "Of course. We aren't 100% on the details," 𝐁𝐬 admitted, smile falling into a terse line. "But the timeline of events seems to flow this way. This League of Villains, as they call themselves, orchestrated the press break in 2 weeks ago, and used it as a distraction to sneak into the school and steal an itinerary for Class 1B, with the intention to use it to find a way to isolate and kill All Might. They chose Class 1B's field trip to the USG as their opportunity to strike, and brought an army of lower-class villains with them to achieve that goal. Alongside the cannon fodder they had one Namu, a bioengineered creature meant to slay All Might, and Kurogiri, a warper that served as their entrance and escape from the USG. Namu was recovered and is being dissected as we speak, and Kurogiri and the ringleader, Shigaraki, were the only two able to escape. What happened to Anan and Midoriya-kun, though?" Yamada insisted. "Patience," 𝐁𝐬 said, putting a hand up to silence his subordinate. "Kuro-san was injured in a fight with Kurogiri, as he was successfully able to warp one of her black holes directly behind her, nearly destroying her suit. As for Midoriya-kun, that is what we are less sure of. From the testimony of Honuki-kun, Tsubaraba-kun, Tsunotori-san, and Shiozaki-san, we can gather that he wound up in the landslide zone, helped to incapacitate the villains present, and then went on a spree to heal any wounded classmates he found." Ken sucked in a harsh breath. Aizawa looked vindicated. "Time to nip that in the bud." "I've read the reports from Shuzenji-san," 𝐁𝐬 said simply. "They aren't pretty. We likely would have lost a student if it were not for Midoriya-kun, as the injury he transferred from Kendo-san likely would have killed. She is not sure how Midoriya-kun survived, but the working theory is that his quirk grants him some form of advanced durability or regeneration that we don't know about yet. It's something we'll have to ask him about when he wakes up." "So what do you want us to do?" Aizawa asked lazily. 𝐁𝐬 shrugged. "Be vigilant. Sweeping changes are already being put in place in lieu of the sports festival's arrival, but it will not hurt to stay on our toes." With that, the door opened. "You are dismissed. All Might, Ken-san, if you could hang back a moment." Yagi gave him a look, but that did not deter 𝐁𝐬. This was simply the safest course of action. Once everybody evacuated the room, the door slammed itself shut once more. "What's this about?" Ken questioned. "I've got a lot on my plate at the moment." Yagi sighed. "Please, we do not need to discuss this, 𝐁𝐬. I've told you already there is no chance the two are connected." 𝐁𝐬's tone was clipped. "I would agree, but what about the Namu? We both know only one person could be behind that." Ken raised an eyebrow. "You two think you know who's behind that whole multiple quirks thing?" "Perhaps," 𝐁𝐬 admitted, despite the clear frown on Yagi's face. "Pray tell, have you ever heard of the boogeyman?" The next few days went by in a blur. Reporters hid around every corner, eager to squeeze any drops of information they could out of any poor UA student that they stumbled across. Itsuka was lucky. Her family didn't let her out of their sight or the house all weekend, which meant she didn't have to deal with that. She was glad they didn't learn about what had truly happened at the USG. They might not have let her return to UA at that rate. Truthfully, she didn't remember much past the initial confrontation. She and Ibara were stuck together in the conflagration zone, desperately fighting for their lives and more for what felt like an eternity. Then there was a glint of steel, her jumping in front of Ibara, and pain. She didn't know how long she was out for. All she knew was that when she woke up, Ibara was practically catatonic, freaking out over her and Midoriya, who had somehow shown up out of nowhere and was bleeding out. Her injury was gone, though, so that was nice. Until Ibara told her exactly where her injury had went. After that, everything became a blur. She remembered All Might showing up and taking Midoriya away, and for the first time since their first day with him, The man wasn't smiling. She remembered talking to the paramedics for a while, and then the police. But things only smoothed out after she got home. 𝐻𝐡𝐤 really hoped Midoriya was okay. She didn't claim to know him that well, they had only spoken a handful of times outside of their mandatory class representative meetings, but he was very kind and soft-spoken. He was a good person. But that pit of dread that had been slowly building up in her gut, ever since that day, was beginning to form a black hole with each passing moment he didn't show up for homeroom. Then the bell rang, and there was still no sign of Midoriya. That really fucked with her. Finally, eventually, mercifully, Ken Sensei showed up. He didn't look too good. "Hello, everyone," he said, voice muted. "I am glad to see you are all okay." "Sensei," Ibara croaked pitifully, before Ken Sensei realized his mistake. He sighed, putting his hand up to silence her. "That was a poor choice of words. I am sorry." He looked towards the lone empty desk in the back corner of the room, a frown set upon his features. "Midoriya-kun is in recovery. We don't know when he will be ready to attend classes again, but you will all be the first to know. Your English period is cancelled for today," Ken Sensei continued, "as I wanted to give you some time to allow me to answer any questions you may have." Just like that, the class erupted, a cacophony of voices drowning out the pregnant silence that had preceded it. From the sound of things, most people were trying to figure out what had happened to Midoriya. Itsuko was quiet. Only one question floated around in her head, and Ken Sensei certainly couldn't answer it for her. Why did Midoriya lay down his life for her? She wasn't sure if she was ready to hear the answer. Whatever it may be, Recovery Girl's office was quiet. Empty, too. Except for one person, laying still in the sole-occupied bed. Izuku had been sleeping for a while. His injuries had been extensive. With a jolt, his eyes shot open. The sudden light made him wince, even if it was muted by the fact that it was nearly dark out. Only the vibrant orange of the sunset provided any light for him. Izuku gulped at the dark outline of several figures standing outside the door to Recovery Girl's office. Whatever happened to him now, Izuku was sure that things had changed as a result of his actions at the 𝐲𝐽. He could only hope it was for the better. Knowing his history, he doubted it. Out of all the people Izuku expected to see after waking up, a police detective, his homeroom teacher, and Recovery Girl were at the top of his list. All Might was not. "Hello, Midoriya-kun," Recovery Girl said gently. "How are you feeling? You gave us quite the fright, dearie." Izuku winced. "Sorry." He winced again at the sound of his voice, raspy and gritty after having gone without water for what was likely at least a few days. "No need to apologize," Recovery Girl tutted. "What you did was very brave. Even most pros wouldn't be willing to do what you did." He blushed, somewhat uncomfortable with the praise. Izuku knew it wasn't something he should be feeling too good about, being willing to get seriously hurt just so others would be all right. But it wasn't exactly like he had any other redeeming qualities. It did feel nice to see All Might nod in agreement from behind her, though his ever-present grin was a tad unnerving given the situation. Recovery Girl walked up to his bedside, lowering her voice so that the others would have to strain to make out what she was saying. "How are your injuries?" she whispered. "The strike Kendo received would have killed her, and should have killed you." Izuku cringed at the news, her tone doing nothing to lessen the blow of the revelation. Even if he had sort of expected it given what he had seen back at the 𝐲𝐽, it wasn't exactly a comforting thought that he should have been dead. But it was better him than one of his classmates. If he had a choice, Izuku would do it all again in a heartbeat to keep them safe. They hadn't immediately hated him, which meant they were some of the kindest people he'd ever met. He even called some of them his friends. He wondered if they would treat him the same way if they knew about how he used to be quirkless. My arm still hurts," he admitted bashfully. "As for my torso, I can't really tell unless I get up and start walking around." Recovery Girl nodded at the information before stepping back and giving him some more breathing room. "That's about what I expected. Considering what happened after the entrance exam, it should come as no surprise to you that my quirk still doesn't react well with yours. The healing will have to be done by your body alone, although based on what we've seen while you were unconscious, it will be a quicker recovery than an average human." Izuku nodded in return. "I figured." With that, Recovery Girl stepped back, turning towards her little computer to check on something or other. It was probably related to him, and Izuku suddenly had the feeling that he'd be the center of many a headache for the youthful heroine. The detective stepped forward next, All Might and Vlad King stepping in line behind. The man was clearly exhausted, and gave Izuku a kind smile with tired eyes and a 5 o'clock shadow that had certainly been left unattended for days. "Hi there, Midoriya-kun," the man greeted. "I'm Detective Tsukachi of the Musatafu Police Department. I just need to ask you a few questions about what happened, if that's okay." He just nodded, not quite trusting his voice, yet underneath the stares of All Might, Vlad King, and the detective. "Well, how about we start off at the beginning?" Tsukachi prodded, pulling out a notepad. "We've gotten the gist of things from your classmates, but I'd still like to hear what happened in your words. Where did the warp villain, Kurogiri, send you?" "The landslide zone," Izuku confirmed, causing the detective to nod and write something down on his notepad. Tsubaraba-san and Honuki-san were there with me. We figured out that the villains didn't know what our quirks were, since they hadn't attacked us, and that gave us time to come up with a plan." Tsukachi nodded. "To create a landslide, right? Wash away the villains." "Something like that, yeah." He wrote down another few lines on his notepad before straightening up a tad. "That's in line with what your classmates told us," he informed Izuku. "But we're a little confused as to what happened afterwards." Izuku shrugged lamely. "Tsubaraba-san hurt his arm as we fell after avoiding the landslide, and I transferred it. I started running around to find anyone else who needed help, but only found Tsunotori-san, Koda-san, and Nyaranjeki-san in the mountain zone before I ran into the conflagration zone. I took Tsunotori-san's sprained ankle, and then found Shiozaki-san and Kendo-san there and transferred her injury. Then I passed out." "That's it?" Tsukachi asked. "Nothing in between then that we should know about?" "Tsukachi," Vlad King began, tone threatening. Izuku looked confused. "No, is there supposed to be something?" Vlad King shook his head. "No. The detective is merely being thorough, right?" Tsukachi nodded. Yes, this all checks out. 2 questions though. Honuki and Tsubaraba both told us that you said your quirk was a simple healing one. Can you explain why you lied to them?" He looked down at his lap. He muttered. "Didn't think they'd react very well if they knew what my quirk did right after transferring Tsubaraba's broken arm. Didn't think they'd let me leave to go looking for anybody else, either." "Makes sense," he replied. "And as for the other one, why? Why did you not simply head for safety, and instead risk your well-being to go and aid your classmates?" Of course they would ask that. Izuku knew why he would do something like that. There were practically a dozen reasons why he had been so willing to throw himself onto the pyre for anybody and everybody in his class. Explaining it to other people, however, wasn't exactly the easiest thing in the world. He couldn't exactly go and say, "Well, their lives are more valuable than mine due to a variety of factors that I am not at liberty to share." Now, could he? All Might noticed the troubled look on his face. Now, Tsukachi-kun. He was merely exhibiting a desire to help those in need, acting as a true hero should. Young Midoriya had the ability and urge to help his friends in danger, and so he acted on those desires. There is nothing wrong with putting the needs of others before your own, even if the risks inherent with young Midoriya's quirk leave something to be desired. Agreed. Vlad King nodded. We can criticize his actions all we want, but it would be quite hypocritical to do so antithetical to the idea of a hero, even. There are some concerns with what happened, yes, but we can deal with this at a later time. Izuku got the strange feeling that they had forgotten he was listening to them. Tsukachi shrugged apologetically. "Just doing my job." He spared Izuku one last glance as he turned to leave the room. "Get well soon, kid. Hope you don't take it the wrong way when I say I hope we don't need to meet up again for a few years." "Yeah?" Izuku blinked as the detective waved and quickly shut the door behind him, not really given the time to say his own goodbyes. Vlad King ran a hand through his hair, looking quite irritated, and All Might just sighed. Izuku felt rather small as he sat up in the cot, while they expressed their exasperation. Vlad King looked very out of his depth as he opened and closed his mouth a few times, trying to figure out the right words to say. "Sorry about him," he said after a minute. "He's good at his job, but he's very thorough." "It's okay," Izuku said simply. Vlad King shook his head. "No, it's not," he insisted. "You and your classmates were through a traumatic experience, one that should not have happened, and that we are responsible for." He could have had a little more tact. All Might interrupted. "You know why he was like that. You're getting distracted." Vlad King sighed again. Yeah, I know," he grunted, just irritated. Izuku looked down at his hands solemnly. Was he mad at him? It wouldn't shock him. "Midoriya-kun," Vlad King continued. "Look at me please. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be honest, all right?" Izuku slowly raised his eyes to meet his teacher's. Instead of the angry or upset look he had expected, 𝐻𝐻𝐿's eyes were filled with concern. He almost didn't believe it. "Did you know just how badly 𝐀𝐦 was hurt when you decided to use your quirk on her?" he asked softly, something that contrasted greatly with his sharp features. Izuku shook his head slightly. "I knew it was bad," he admitted. "But I couldn't really gauge just how bad her wound was based on just what I saw. There wasn't a lot of time for me to act, either. Because I was pretty sure she was in shock. I didn't think it would leave me out for, 3 days, All Might added helpfully before his tone grew slightly more somber. "I must apologize to you, young Midoriya." "What?" Izuku squeaked. "What do you have to apologize to me for, sir?" All Might frowned again. "Well, as the years have gone on, I must admit that I am not as spry as I used to be. Even the symbol of peace is only a man, after all." Izuku blinked. But you're All Might. Even if you're getting, a little older, you're still the greatest hero ever. And why would you have to apologize to me for that?" "Patience, young Midoriya," All Might chuckled. "But as I was saying, being a hero at my age, it takes a little bit more out of me each year that goes by. When I applied to become a teacher at UA, I was expected to put my teaching career before my hero one, even if only temporarily. Unfortunately, in my hubris I foolishly thought I could do both. The morning of the Ust attack, I had spent a lot of my energy on simply fighting petty crime that I had passed on my way to work. Had I left it to the heroes who already had the situations under control, I would have been more prepared, more able to battle the villains who threatened the lives of you and your classmates. For this, I cannot apologize enough." Oh, Izuku didn't really know how to respond to his idol apologizing. It's okay, really. It's not like you could have known about this, you were just doing your job as the symbol of peace." Nobody else got hurt, right?" 𝐻𝐻𝐿 nodded. "Aside from a few scrapes and bruises here and there. You and 13 were the only ones severely injured." Then it's okay," he tried. I'm fine now, so." All Might put up a hand to silence him. "It worked extraordinarily well. You may have survived, young Midoriya, but you were severely injured in no small part due to my negligence. You may be fine now, yes, but what if you weren't? What if you were too slow to reach 𝐀𝐦, and something worse happened? It is precisely because of what could have been that my actions were so unforgivable." His eyes hardened. It will not happen again. Even if Izuku wasn't the target of All Might's furious stare, he still gulped. It's still okay. Apology accepted." All Might chuckled. "You are far too kind, young Midoriya. You have my sincerest thanks." He nodded back slowly, and All Might looked satisfied. His face took on a conflicted expression, as though he were struggling through a mental battle. But before Izuku could ask if he was okay, 𝐻𝐻𝐿 began to talk again. "So, Midoriya-kun," he began gruffly, "I have some good news and bad news. Which would you like to hear first?" Izuku made a face. He didn't know what he was about to hear, but he couldn't imagine it was anything good. Good news first, please." "All right." 𝐻𝐻𝐿 nodded. "You've only missed 1 day of school, and your classmates were happy to compile the notes and homework you've missed for you. Your teachers are also very understanding, and you can have as much time as you need to catch up on your studies. Everyone was very worried about you." Izuku's face flushed. It was still strange to hear that people actually cared about him now. If 𝐻𝐻𝐿's words were accurate, he was going to be in for some awkward conversations whenever he returned back to class. "And the bad news?" he asked hesitantly. 𝐻𝐻𝐿 frowned. "Due to your injuries," he continued, "you are going to be unable to participate in most of your foundational hero studies exercises for the foreseeable future, at least until your arm heals." Izuku winced slightly, but he had expected that. "Is that it?" His teacher shook his head. "No. The sports festival was planned for next week, as you know, and despite many arguments, Principal Nezu decided to keep us on schedule and host it anyways." Oh. Izuku's small form began to tremble. I see. The sports festival. One of the most important events of the year for hero students, UA, and all of Japan. The chance that all hero students use to put themselves out there for the world, and more importantly, the hero agencies of Japan, to observe and hopefully find an interest in. And Izuku wasn't going to be able to compete. Because of course not. When would the universe choose not to fuck him over? 𝐻𝐻𝐿 and All Might shared a look. Neither of them looked thrilled with his reaction, although there was a grim acceptance shared between the two heroes. You will still be receiving offers from 𝐴 related hero agencies, 𝐷 King offered. Your situation will be explained to any and all hero agencies willing to hear us out, and can still give you offers at their discretion. Izuku sniffled pathetically. Oh, okay. All Might thought he looked like a kicked puppy. No, that was too kind. He looked like a puppy that had been starved for weeks and left to die. I am so sorry, young Midoriya, All Might said again. Izuku really didn't feel like crying in front of All Might and his homeroom teacher. But if this continued for much longer, he wouldn't have much of a choice in the matter. I want to go home, he whispered. 𝐷 King nodded solemnly. I understand. You just need to go through one last checkup with Recovery Girl, and you'll be free to go. He and All Might made for the door, with the blood hero turning around one last time to face him. We're here for you if you need anything, Midoriya-kun, he finished. Please remember that I meant what I said at the beginning of the school year. If you ever need anything, or just want to talk, I'm here for you. And with that, Izuku was alone again aside from Recovery Girl, who gently poked and prodded at him to see how stable he was. He didn't bother to try and hide his tears anymore. At least she didn't comment on them. Izuku was really close to not going to school the next morning. His cast felt heavy on his arm, and the gauze around his torso that he had to change daily on Recovery Girl's orders wasn't doing much to help things. Everything kind of felt pointless. Why should he bother? It wasn't like he could participate in the classes that actually mattered for his future, if he even had one with how useless he was. He wasn't going to get a chance to do anything during the sports festival. Either. What was 𝐴 going to do? Tell hero agencies that they had a student whose quirk was getting himself hurt? What a joke. He'd probably get laughed out of the room if any of those agencies tried to meet him. And what about his classmates? He remembered how freaked out Shiozaki had been when he had used his quirk on Kendo back at the USJ. Would the rest of them react in a similar manner? Probably. He was a freak through and through, and his quirk only solidified that. Sure, Bondo and Fukudashi had accepted him and his quirk, but knowing what he could do and actually experiencing it were two different things. What if Shiozaki told him all about what he had done and everybody became weirded out by him? What if Honuki and Tsuburaba realized he'd lied to their faces and resented him? What if Izuku took a shuddering breath? There was no point in dwelling on the what-ifs. He'd done that enough in his life already. Besides, 𝐷 King had said they were worried about him, hadn't he? Maybe he was just trying to make Izuku feel better. He'd gotten pretty good at reading people. 𝐷 King didn't seem like the type of person to lie to him about something as trivial as that. Eventually, he did get out of bed, right before any more stalling would have made him tardy. Maybe it was his buried spite for everyone and everything that eventually forced him up. Maybe he had some naive view that things would be the same as they were. It did mean that he didn't have time to make breakfast for himself, but he could make do. He'd done so many times before, nothing would make today any different. Nothing but silence greeted him as he exited his room, his tie haphazardly thrown together around his neck. Not that anything else ever did. It was just a door. He really shouldn't be struggling this much. Just a door to his homeroom. Why was he shaking at the prospect of seeing his classmates again? He was a nobody. He'd probably just walk in and sit down, and no one would notice him. It was as simple as that, wasn't it? Yeah, it would be fine. He opened the door. 20 pairs of eyes landed on him immediately. Izuku practically wilted underneath the shocked stares of his classmates, timidly waving his one good arm. Hi, Midoriya. He couldn't pick out who it was who said his name first. But it didn't really matter considering just about everyone joined in, and also rushed over to him. Shiozaki was the first to reach him, and she looked like she was going to collapse in relief as her eyes met his. Thank the Lord, she cried, clasping her hands together in prayer as a small light descended on her from somewhere. My prayers were not in vain. Tsuburaba interrupted, throwing his arms out wide. Midoriya-kun. What the heck, man? Why didn't you tell me your quirk was so manly? Testutetsu roared. You're like a noodlier version of Crimson Riot. People were starting to crowd around him. He let out a tiny eep as everybody got as close as they could to him and continued to try and talk over each other to speak. It wasn't a pleasant experience. You didn't have to heal me, Pony squeaked out in English. If you hurt yourself when you use your quirk, dude, Fukudashi shouted, the O_O emoticon popping up in his speech bubble. Why's your arm in a cast? Shouldn't Recovery Girl have? Enough. That single word was enough to get the entire class to immediately shut up and back up. with everybody parting for Vlad King to make his way over to Izuku, who knew he looked like he wasn't having a good time. I understand that all of you are relieved to see your friend, he sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. But please, give Midoriya-kun some time to breathe. Yes. The last thing he needs right now is 19 faces shouting in his ears. Yes? A chorus of mumbles rang out through the room. Yes, Kan-sensei. Izuku let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding in, only to freeze up once again as everyone's eyes remained locked on him. I'm glad you're all okay, 𝐻𝐸𝐬 rolled her eyes. Dude, you're the one who got hurt. And the one who apparently went around making sure he was the only one hurt, too. Shishida nodded sternly in agreement. To think Midoriya possessed such a noble spirit behind such a plain demeanor. Looks truly are deceiving. Was that an insult? Oase snorted as he asked the question, and Shishida turned pale at the accusation. Why, I would never, he balked, causing Kaibara and Rin to laugh at their large classmate. Tetsutetsu clapped him on the back, causing him to wince and nearly stumble at the force. You're so manly. Teach me your ways. Hey, metalhead, Honuki started, pulling him back from a groaning Izuku. Are you too dumb to realize he's still injured? Tetsutetsu blinked as Honuki grabbed his face and pointed it in the direction of his left arm, and the cast that covered it. He'd had to make some modifications to his sleeve to get his uniform on. Oh, that's odd, Yanagi said quietly. Why didn't Recovery Girl heal you? Izuku shrugged his good arm lamely. We don't know why. But both of our quirks have their own distinct kinds of healing factors. And for some reason they don't, play well with each other, he explained quickly. I heal at an accelerated rate compared to a normal person, but not by much, and my body rejects Recovery Girl's quirk. He looked down at the ground forlornly, his mood ruined once again. It's not going to be healed in a week, at any rate. Izuku didn't bother meeting any of his classmates' eyes at that revelation. But if he did, he would have seen surprise, grief, and guilt flash across just about all of them. Fukadashi made a hissing noise. Ouch, man, he said, once he realized nobody else was going to say anything. That blows. Yeah, Izuku mumbled. Bondo flicked Fukadashi in the arm. Real nice, he whispered. What was I supposed to say? Fukadashi hissed back. Sucks to be you. They weren't as quiet as they thought. Izuku hesitated. It's okay. There's nothing I can do about it. If anything, people just felt worse after he said that. Tsunatori's eyes widened. Oh, she shouted, causing several glances to be thrown her way. I know, let's write Izuku's cast. Komori cocked her head at the American. What? Do you mean sign? Tsunatori nodded fervently. Yeah, that. When my friends got hurt in America, we all signed their casts. She hurried over to Izuku, eyes sparkling and a marker in her hand as she smiled brightly at him. Can I? What was with Tsunatori and violating his personal space? He didn't mind that much, but she made him blush like an idiot every time she did it. Okay? Yes, Tsunatori whooped as she grabbed Izuku's hand and pulled it out in front of her, scribbling on the plaster that encased his injured arm. After a moment she let go, and Izuku's face lit up on the redness. There you go. Just like with her number in his phone contacts, she had written Pony in big, bold letters across his cast. The purple of the marker contrasted pretty hard against the alabaster white, he thought. She had also drawn a crude depiction of a horse beneath her name. Hey, Fukadashi said, already grabbing his own marker from his bag. Me next. I call next, someone else yelled. All of a sudden, Izuku had 18 people scrambling to sign his cast and put their own little unique mark on his accessory. It wasn't anything he was familiar with in any capacity, but it was nice. He'd never expected that he'd have an entire class of people who wanted to interact with him and let him know they were concerned with his well-being. The feeling was so nice, he was able to ignore the one person in the room who wasn't trying to interact with him. It was a little difficult, though, considering Kendu's indecipherable stare never strayed from him. Lunch was weird. After what was a relatively normal first half of the day, where each period was started by one of his teachers talking about how happy they were to see him again, he had thought the strange events were over. And then half the class decided to sit with him, Fukadashi, and Bondo at their usual table. He was crammed between Tetsutetsu and Bondo, who was thankfully cognizant enough to leave Izuku some breathing room for his broken arm, with Shishida and Honuki also on their side of the table. Fukadashi, Nyaranjeki, 𝐻𝐸𝐬, Yui, and Pony sat on the other side, and the other half of their class was seated at the closest table they could find. It was quite the contrast from the first handful of weeks of school, to say the least. He didn't say much, but he didn't have to. At least 2 conversations were going on at any given point, and usually there were more. Right now he was simply nodding along to Fukadashi's story about what had happened yesterday while he was recovering. I'm telling ya, he rambled on, I've never seen 𝐾𝐦 so angry. When someone from class 1 started mouthing off about how lucky we were to get attacked by villains, she ripped them a new one. Yui nodded in agreement. Wanna sucks. Hell yeah they do. Tetsu slammed his fist on the table at the mention of their sister class. Total pricks, the lot of them. That general education kid was a self-centered douche, too. Izuku blinked. Who? Some purple-haired kid that decided to come and talk smack to us about how he missed out on the hero course, Fukadashi explained casually. Said how if non-hero course kids do well enough in the sports festival, they can take our spots. Well then. Wasn't that ominous? As Fukadashi noticed the uncomfortable look on his face, the boy quickly tried to backtrack. But, I'm sure he's all bark and no bite. Indeed, Shishida added. He had quite the unsavory attitude. If he truly intends to become a hero, he has a lot of work to do. Izuku hoped they were right. He couldn't imagine Vlad King and his other teachers dropping him out from the hero course. If some general education kid did a good job in the sports festival, considering just why he couldn't participate and all. But it didn't do anything to soothe his frayed nerves. He felt like had a right to fear the worst at this point. Tetsu opened his mouth to add something. Likely about how manly Izuku was, he still didn't understand what his classmate was talking about, but was cut off as a shadow fell over the group. Excuse me, Midoriya-kun, 𝐾𝐦 said politely, her face betraying no hints as to what she was feeling. Can I talk to you? Izuku blinked as he stared up at the redhead. She looked even taller while he was sitting down. Sure, he responded. What do you need? She fidgeted in place for a second as some of the others at the table also turned to look at her. In private, she clarified. Oh. Bondo slid out of the booth to allow Izuku to get up before he responded. But it wasn't as if he was going to say no. Even if the thought of talking to one of his female classmates was almost enough to turn him into a tomato, he didn't think she would do anything malicious. He hurried to follow her out into the hallway where there were no prying ears. And soon enough it was just Izuku and 𝐾𝐦 awkwardly staring at each other. So, he muttered, breaking the silence and their eye contact as he looked anywhere but at 𝐾𝐦. What did you want to talk about? 𝐾𝐦 rubbed the back of her head, also averting her eyes from him. She started, just as stiff as he was. I just wanted to say thank you. For the 𝐬𝐡𝐢. You didn't have to use your quirk on me, you know. Izuku nearly did a double take at her words, but was able to keep a straight face. He realized that if 𝐾𝐦 thought he didn't have to heal her, then that meant nobody had told her about how bad the injury was, something he was actually rather okay with, considering he really didn't know how he'd react if people started thinking they owed him their lives or something. It was also pretty weird hearing someone say thank you to him. Most of the time people ran away screaming after they realized the drawback to his quirk. It freaked people out pretty hard. It's okay. He stumbled over his words once he realized she was still waiting for a response. It's kind of all that my quirk is good for, so I'm, happy to help. He nearly said I instead of my quirk, but caught himself at the last second. He didn't need his classmates thinking he was any weirder than he was, and he hoped 𝐾𝐦 hadn't noticed the near slip-up. Still, 𝐾𝐦 insisted, it's not fair that you're forced to miss out on the sports festival because of me. Izuku frantically waved his one good hand out in front of him. Don't blame yourself, he said, surprised. I'm the one who chose to use my quirk. It's not your fault. Besides, I probably wouldn't have even done that well in the sports festival. What with my quirk not really being very helpful, and not being particularly great at this kind of stuff, 𝐾𝐦 frowned at his words. You shouldn't put yourself down like that, she said, her voice oddly soft. You're in the hero course for a reason, Midoriya. You work just as hard as the rest of us. Maybe even more. If anybody deserves to get seen by the pros, it's you. Izuku's face erupted in scarlet at her words, brain already sputtering to a halt. She blinked. Are you okay? Why, yeah, I'm fine, he finally managed to stammer out, still beet red. Thanks for saying that, 𝐾𝐦-san. She smiled gently at him. Don't worry about it, Midoriya-kun. You don't have to be so formal, you know. We're friends, aren't we? Izuku blushed again, looking down at his feet. Sure, he mumbled, rubbing his cast. Fukadashi tells me to loosen up a lot, too. 𝐾𝐸 giggled at his reaction. before whispering something that sounded suspiciously like Pony was right. He does look like a strawberry. He started to wheeze. It took him a minute to calm himself down, and Kendu began to speak again. Seriously, though, thank you Midoriya, she repeated. If there's anything I can do for you in the future, don't hesitate to ask. Izuku fidgeted in place for a moment, before offering her a sheepish smile. Got a pen? You can sign my cast if you want. Kendu smirked, already pulling out a green marker that matched the color of her eyes. I thought you'd never ask.